Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special episode of Heterodox History. Today, we are going to be discussing a relatively obscure docudrama series made by the BBC nearly 50 years ago. It was made in 1974. And after I've introduced our speakers for this evening, it would be a good topic, I think, to venture as to how we came across it and why we decided to talk about this evening. So I'm very lucky to be joined by Furious Pertinax. Hello.
Good evening, everyone. Lovely to be here, and wonderful to have the chance to talk about this, like you say, kind of obscure but wonderful show. Quite excited for tonight.
And of course, Charlemagne, you've been with us quite a lot recently, so it's lovely to have you back.
Thank you. Good afternoon. And yes, I'm very excited to talk about this show. It was quite a surprise when I saw you were scheduling a stream for it.
Fantastic. So I'll probably ask you first then, Charlemagne. How did you find this series and what does it mean to you?
Well, one Fritz Imperial, who the distributors actually interviewed just the other day, showed this to me in Discord, and I eventually looked it up and actually purchased the series and enjoyed it immensely. And then, of course, I actually shilled the series quite a bit. Mr. Panama Hat, who did eventually watch it, and unfortunately, so.
Right. And Furious, how about you?
Successful. And
sorry, Charlemagne, you're cutting out a bit. I'm not sure whether it's my internet or.
It's definitely me.
Charlie cut out for me as well. I don't know, Charlie, if you just want to go back to what you were saying, because you cut out just after you mentioned Discord or Fritz, so just go back to where you were.
Yeah, Fritz told me about the series on Discord. Fritz Imperial, who the distributors just interviewed the other day, and I also showed it to Panama Hat as well. So I just wanted to credit him with successfully spreading this rather obscure series around. As far as what it means to me, I'm very happy to see a series that honestly attempts a fair portrayal of the European monarchies in the period from the revolutions of 1848 up until the First World War. I think it handles everything very fairly, and it's sort of like, I suppose, the Lord of the Rings in a way, which is kind of in our minds now, where that type of content that honestly portrays this important part of history, as Tolkien was, can't be made anymore. And we will never get another show like this in our lives again, I think. And so I'm just really happy that this exists and we can share it with people.
And how about you, Furious? Hello?
Yes. Yeah, sorry, I'm here. Yeah, indeed, it's interesting how we've all stumbled across this. Mine was actually long before I entered this sort of YouTube sphere with you wonderful gentlemen. I used to dabble in for those who are familiar with like Paradox Interactive and the games that they make. I was still kind of am, but involved with certain like modifications for Hearts of Iron 4, and one of my roles was acquiring music for one of them. And interestingly enough, I came across a rendition of the German folk song Wacht am Rhein, Watch the Rhine, which is an old German patriotic song that harkens back to even before the period of this show. And one of the videos actually had clips of Bismarck's interactions with the Kaiser and with the Crown Prince and with Moltke. And I thought, wow, that's actually looks like a really interesting show. And I was familiar with the actor Kurt Jurgens, who I occasionally use his icon here as a display avatar. So I was familiar with him, but I just never knew what the show was. And of course, the YouTube comments would say, "Oh, it's it's this show, Fallen Eagles, whatever." And then I'd watch clips of it. This was before it was uploaded to YouTube sometime later. I believe you can still find it on YouTube in its entirety. But I was enamored with it. I just thought, wow, there's this wonderful production from years and years ago. And being from the Anglosphere, as our audience knows, I actually grew up to some degree with the tradition of watching sort of BBC productions. People in my family used to watch like the old Jane Austen, shows and Forsyth Saga, and I myself was familiar with Peter Ustinov, who used to act in a lot of these things as well. Little Curiosity Shop, for instance, the old sort of Dickensian novels that the BBC would make at this time period and sort of years either side of this. And yeah, some of the actors that were in those were also in Fall of Eagles, and I just sort of noticed these faces and thought, I have to get a copy of this. And I just, as we're talking pre-show, I managed to find a copy that was brand new for sale from some like obscure Australian distributor of DVDs of BBC, ABC stuff, and I got myself a brand new copy of it on DVD because I just thought this will be impossible to find in 20 years time. And if I have a family of my own, I'd love my own kids to watch it, because like Charlie says, it's for all of its faults, because there are faults in this show, it is an honest portrayal, or at least an attempt of an honest and authentic portrayal of the events and these people of these times before the contamination of which we're familiar today that exists in modern media, was a part of it. So I think it's an ornament in that sense. It's a time capsule of the way media used to be before our own time.
Well, it's interesting you say contamination, because I will argue there is contamination in the series, but nevertheless not the contamination we're used to today.
Yes,
which is
indeed.
quite interesting. But no, it's actually my own story. I mean, I first watched this when I was about 17. I just found it on YouTube, and I recommend everyone who's out there, perhaps buy a copy, but you can watch it all for YouTube. And I do believe through YouTube, it's actually gained a wider circulation. I mean, I think the videos up there have hundreds of thousands of views. So more and more people are finding it and watching it. And I think that's actually sort of helped, modern reviewers sort of write it and increase its IMDb score and things like that. So there is attention directed to it. But no, regarding the series, was the first sort of exposure I had to that sort of period in history from Austria's point of view. And really, it's sort of one of the sort of elements, I think, which sort of wanted me to sort of invest more time and interest in Prussia of the 19th century and Austria when I decided to study all these places seriously. So it has a special place in my heart. Nevertheless, there are problems with it. I've called the stream an historical diamond in the rough, and that's how I view it. And just for reference sake, what I find fascinating about the early sort of 1970s, or late 1960s, 1970s. I mean, in 1964, you had the Great War series of documentaries broadcasting about World War One, really, for the first time over, I think, 26 episodes. And from the 1970s, you just had a glut of these cheaply made yet very well written with Shakespearean actors series. For example, there is The Six Wives of Henry VIII, Elizabeth R., The Edwardians. More than I can name. I mean, so many others that have just sort of been lost in time, and there aren't DVDs of them. And I think even the BBC archives have lost copies of them as well. I even just
which is a huge tragedy in its own right, if you think about it.
Well, maybe that's just a reflection of their quality. I mean, one of the things I also found out is that there was a series based on Churchill's Histories of the English-speaking Peoples, which had, I think, 24 episodes, which was made in the same year, I think, of Fall of Eagles, but it just fell off and no one wanted to watch it. So it's just interesting that there is this glut of history documentaries. But why does Fall of Eagles, also between, miniseries, so 6 episodes to 13 episodes. So why does Fall of Eagles stand out compared to all the rest? Well, I still think, going back to Elizabeth R. in particular is one of my sort of all-time favorites. But Fall of Eagles stands out to me because it is part a soap opera regarding the 3 royal families represented by the Eagles here, the Romanovs on the left, the Hohenzollerns in the center, and the Habsburgs on the right. And it is part documentary series as well. Yet it is also, in many ways, an anthology series continuing on from the vein of the Edwardians. So it is all these things, and yet it never sort of achieves, you can say, being a masterpiece as one of these. It aspires, it's very ambitious in terms of the broad scope of history, but I think it just falls apart when it comes to the overall general execution. But saying that, there are individual episodes which are brilliant in terms of showcasing elements of obscure history, especially for English language viewers who will never be exposed to any of this in any modern documentary, or even the majority of commentary regarding this history, even professional commentary regarding this, which I find so fascinating. And so in that sense, it is a very rare gem and worth watching, even though there are some problems with it. I mean, my point of view is, regarding this, looking at what the series is and looking at it through the veins of constructive criticism and what the writers were trying to achieve and what can sort of be rearranged to try and improve it for a sequel that will never be made. I mean, the only or a remake that'll never be made. I mean, even
ladies and gentlemen, categorize this as another hypothetical stream.
I mean, even the term "Fall of Eagles" I found sufficiently endearing to create a mini series on my own channel regarding the 3 final emperors of these respective empires, which you can access if you become a member of the channel. So I've always found this idea very endearing. But no, the only thing that sort of comes close, I think, to, I would say, interrogating this idea, this aspect of history in terms of like more recent documentaries, was a thing that came out to commemorate the centenary of the beginning of World War One back in 2014, and it was called The 37 Days. The BBC produced it again, and it was 3 episodes chronicling the July crisis, which, if anything, in an ideal world, would act as a companion piece, because this series doesn't do justice to the July crisis. Nevertheless, I feel that this series, oddly, is far superior in terms of its writing and its nuance to the 37 Days, even though it has Ian McDiarmid, who I'm sure everyone is aware is playing Palpatine, is playing Earl Grey. Miscast, interestingly enough, because he was nothing like Earl Grey, but sufficiently interesting to create a sort of wrapped drama around it. But even aspects of that, beyond sort of Germany and Britain, which are the central focuses of that show, all the other nations are either sort of passive, or in the case of Austria, just blatant caricatures, and I find that actually very offensive, and there are glaring omissions. So when I'm going through this series, there isn't so much really to critique in terms of the actual presentation of information. Rather, the issues I have with it are to do with narrative framing and sort of sins of omission, effectively, what was discussed and what wasn't discussed. And I feel almost to you can say buttress the narrative whole of the series really ought to be discussed, but nevertheless interesting. So we'll start off chronologically sort of cataloguing this series, and it's going to be very effective for people listening to this because it is chronological. There aren't any sort of flashbacks, so it is presented as a history beginning in 1848 and ending in 1918. So in that sense, this series presents itself as a history, and we will reflect upon that. Marcus?
Just before we start, yes, I just want to say just one quick point, because you actually mentioned 37 days, and it was on my mind, but I didn't think to actually state it. But yes, I dare say it's probably one of the more recent things that has been made that, like you say, despite some of the other nations being displayed as caricatures, whether it's, the Prussian militarists and the uppity Austrians, and, there's certain caricatures that are obvious in 37 days. It is in itself a pretty nice production, and for anyone who's interested in modern history, I would actually advise even buying it, because it's one of the rare modern productions that's actually worthwhile watching, and the acting in it is actually quite good, I think, despite its flaws. But there's one thing about, well, I suppose it's kind of true of 37 Days, but it's especially true of these older productions like Fall of Eagles, is that, and it's why, for instance, when people, if you've ever heard me on Mr. Prudential stream when we've talked about Ben-Hur, or if we've talked about other movies, for instance, where it's like Das Boot, or the old Spartacus movie, or whatever, it doesn't matter, is what I love about things made in this time is that it did not insult the audience, in that it respected the fact that people actually were educated and were erudite, and had a comprehension of the time being covered, even if it was a moderate understanding or even a lesser understanding of it. The people who were watching this were not insulted by the producers. The language and the dialogue is rich. The length of the episodes, particularly in Legend of Eagles, are actually quite long.
It's not just the dialogue that's rich. The dialogue is often taken directly from the sources as well.
Exactly. It's very true to history. And moreover, the episode length, they don't try and do it in 30 minutes. These episodes are actually quite long, and they don't insult you by thinking, oh, you only have like a 40-minute attention span. And the length of the whole series, if you watch, is actually quite extensive. But I actually like that. I like the fact that it doesn't insult our notion of attention span. And I think Fall of Eagles is such a fantastic exemplar of that. I just wanted to say that from the onset, because for people who don't know, it is a long series, but it is worth investing your time in if you want to enjoy it.
I suppose the other thing the BBC has going for it are those subpar David Reynolds documentaries, if you want to listen to his
True.
various impressions of historical characters.
Yes.
Anyway, moving on. So the first episode, and I'm just going to reference with images from the actual history, focuses on the ascent of Franz Josef, and it's called the Death Waltz, and it looks into the early marriage of Franz Josef and Elizabeth, known as Sisi. And the unfortunate thing I find about this episode is that it's very slow. It's probably one of the weakest episodes in the whole show. I think the only episode that is probably as weak or possibly worse is what is it? Tell the King the Sky is Falling, which is the 11th episode in the 13th series, only because it sets up an interesting dynamic between Sisi and Franz Josef, and then it doesn't go anywhere. And the more sort of research I go into this, it really does seem that with some of the episodes, that you have an overarching sort of aim of what the season is trying to accomplish, which is, you know, the soap opera, the dramatic decline, the tragedy of the fall of the three royal houses. But then it feels also very much that you get in these individual writers who want to tell a particular story. And as a result of that, it doesn't gel particularly well with the rest of the story. And that turns out almost exactly to be the case when I did research on it, because the two main writers of the series are John Eliot and Jack Pullman. Jack Pullman would later go on and become the adapter of I, Claudius. So he would have a very distinguished career. He was also responsible for adapting the BBC drama of War and Peace back, I think it was in the 1970s. Whereas John Eliot, I would be interested to understand, because there's scarce little information about the background for this series. I'd be very interested to understand why John Eliot wanted so to tell a story about the dramatic fall of the three empires in the East, the Holy Alliance, the Dreikaiserbund, because the only credit to his name, which is in any way sort of historical, was one episode of The Shadow of the Tower, which was a prequel series to Elizabeth R, focusing on the reign of Henry VII. So a very sort of scant a filmography to sort of justify why he would want to turn to this. And there was, of course, also Stuart Burge, who is the producer of this show. So the fascinating thing about all of these individual episodes is they play out like one-act Shakespearean plays. You have the host of characters. There is an overall sort of plot, and they are often portrayed very well with very good dialogue. And to try and condense what the Death Waltz is, the Death Waltz very much seems to me like a homage of Ernst Marischke's Sisi trilogy from 1955 until 57. I mean, even the second film of that, which is The Young Empress, the plot is basically the same. It is a feud between the Archduchess Sophie, who is the emperor's mother, and Sisi over influencing the emperor, and ultimately Sisi wins. Now, what I find rather bizarre about this episode is that there is so much setup. You come to the conclusion of this where she's talking to Julia Andrássy, the leader of the Hungarian party, because Hungary is a huge factor in this episode. And it looks like she's going to, you know, assume her own role. She's going to become the dominant partner in this alliance. But then it's never really reflected on, and the whole sort of narrative peters out. And it's completely eclipsed when we get to the next episode where Austria talks about, is referenced, which is the Myelin Affair. So I sort of wonder what the overall achievement is, because, of course, in order to portray that in the Sisi films, we have that triumph for Sisi, which is her coronation as the Queen of Hungary, which is, you could say, the summation, the zenith of her love of Hungary and her aspirations for the Hungarian people within that whole sphere of history. Of course, in order to portray it in that film, that has to be portrayed anachronistically, because the film only covers the period before 1960. Before 1860, sorry, before the Battle for Solferino. So you can say that this episode is more historically accurate, but as a result of it, it doesn't have that dramatic climax which is needed if you want to sum this up. I also find it very interesting that the episode focuses so much on the question of Hungary. And you would have thought that if you bring up the question of Hungary so prominently to start off your series, you know, put your best foot forward, this is going to have a huge bearing on the rest of the series. But it really doesn't. After this episode, Hungary is mentioned as a political sticking point in episode 4, and then it never really comes up again. And this is where I wonder sort of what the original sort of plans of the series were. Because I think a perfect way to sort of conclude this would be if you start off with Hungary, And then at the end of the series, you bring back Blessed Karl, and then you have him trying to reclaim the Hungarian throne, which is the real fall of the final eagle. And because that doesn't happen, therefore this series begins, I think, very weakly, and you have to sort of endure CC, or in many cases just skip it before you get to the next episode, where Marcus, you get to the more iconic moments where you look at Bismarck and his relationship with Wilhelm I, the Prusso-Austrian War, the Franco-Prussian War, all the bits of history which everyone is really excited for. So I almost wonder, why does this episode really even exist? Because I really do feel that you could do without this episode. If you're not going to reference the broader aspects of 1848 at all, really, apart from the Hungarian aspect.
I want to reflect basically everything you said there back to you. Of course, the show does open up briefly talking about the revolution, but essentially as backdrop, and the whole episode, unfortunately, as the first episode, really almost feels like an afterthought, because virtually nothing that happens in the episode really has a larger bearing on the rest of the series. It almost seems like the point of the episode is simply to provide some sort of background and characterization for Franz Josef, who doesn't appear in the series again for quite some time in any significant capacity. And then again, you mentioned they spend quite a lot of time actually in this episode around the intrigues on Hungary. Or maybe that's episode 2, but I think it's in the first one. And yeah, it just doesn't really come up again. So you kind of wonder, well, what is the point of presenting this information to the audience? And even aside from that, like you said, it's not a particularly great episode purely just from a narrative perspective. It doesn't really have much payoff. So it is not a very good opener to the show. And I would suggest, if you do attempt to watch the show, definitely stick it out at least until episode 3, because the first 2 aren't really as gripping as some of the later episodes can be.
I mean, just in terms of why I think this happened, I really think that one of the writers, the BBC, in this case Hugh Whitemore, came to John Eliot and said, I want to do a homage to the CC trilogy. And they said, okay, let's just do that. It fits in with the themes. Because if you're going to set this up as a soap opera concerning the 3 empires, then you really need to talk about 1848 in the round, how they affected all of the empires, not just Austria, and not just from the point of view of Hungary, but also the Crimean War is entirely omitted. Nicholas I and his involvement in crushing the Hungarian revolt is entirely omitted. Given how crucial a factor this is in history in terms of the alienation of Austria and Russia, and how these countries will come to blows later on, it seems really very strange that you focus on this aspect. And I really do therefore think it is the particular interest of one particular writer to tell, again, one story which has already been told before, which is that of the CC trilogy. And just on your note at the beginning, Charlemagne, sorry, I'll just get to in a second, Marcus. The narrator is Michael Hordern. And Michael Hordern is almost like the omniscient historian throughout the series. When you hear Michael Hordern, it sort of almost ceases to be a drama and it becomes a documentary. He speaks almost with the full force of hindsight and historical provenance behind him. And I would say the writing, the first sort of words that come out of it are actually very weak. If I remember them correctly, because I haven't watched this series in a while, it's something like revolutionary upheaval leads to traditional ideas of monarchy being questioned. I mean, that's not exciting enough really to start off a sort of series about the dramatic fall. And of course, it's just focusing on Hungary. So I do think this is a misstep. And I think perhaps it would have been better almost to look at this series starting with episode 2. Episode 2 is a prelude to episode 3, which is the real beginning of the series, when Michael Hordern talks about the Dreikaiserbund.
Yeah, good point. One thing I will say just about, because I actually didn't know that background about would you say it was the producer or the writer who sort of did the homage to CC?
Oh,
was it the writer?
All the episodes have the individual writers. So this is Hugh Whitemore who wrote.
Okay, so Hugh
he only writes this episode. He only writes this episode. Yeah.
So the fact that this one writer who writes one episode sort of does his homage, as you say, is kind of telling. See, I didn't know that. What I did want to say is that I think sort of focusing on Austria, because like you say, they start with Austria and they don't go back to Austria sort of until I think the next sort of time window that they sort of go back to Austria is about sort of 1870-ish, maybe after the Austrian-Prussian War, I think might be when they sort of cycle back to Austria, which is decades later. So there's sort of this comprehensive time gap, which I think disrupts the continuity of the show from the Austrian standpoint. You might want to correct me on that.
Yes, I mean, Austria is basically not covered from 1860 up until 1889. And when it is sort of covered, you have von Taffer being the presenter telling us what happened in the interim, which is very anticlimactic based on the previous episode. Yeah.
And it feels sort of disjointed and lacking comprehension, considering how much detail actually exists in the time differences between A and B. Nonetheless,
and they don't go over the political situation. When Austria returns properly to the narrative, it's simply to show how the successors to Franz Josef die, and not really cover any of the political backdrop. But anyway, go on.
No, of course. And so I think for them, it was a way of creating sort of like the start of the narrative arc for the series. But I actually do agree with you, and sort of Charlie, you've alluded to this too, but I certainly agree with the idea that probably starting, if not with 1848 itself, but with the immediate aftermath of 1848, or perhaps like a brief coverage of it. Because if you look at the history, if you read, because you and I have both read Iron Kingdom, AM, that you have this instance where the German, because he wasn't Kaiser at that point, but I think it would have been the Crown Prince, which ends up obviously being Emperor Wilhelm I in the show, is greeted in Berlin with the revolutionary German flag, which is the modern day flag, which is the yellow, the black and the red flag, right? Rather than the imperial flag. And this sort of tension that exists or the royal flag, and this tension that actually exists in Germany. And then Bismarck in episode 2 mentions how he's been dismissed from Frankfurt for being reactionary and rude to the Austrians, as he says in the show, rather than actually having scenes of Bismarck in Frankfurt or leaving Frankfurt. So there's this kind of lack of
to be honest, I mean, to my mind, the biggest, missing, I would love to see more of Bismarck just in general. I mean, the actor playing him is
Kurt Jürgens.
Kurt Jürgens, and he is absolutely fantastic.
I dare say he's one of the best actors in the show. Like, his portrayal of Bismarck is amazing.
I mean, Kurt Jürgens and Barry Foster, I mean, they almost, whenever I think of these historical figures, I think of these actors playing their role. But just on that, I mean, just having one episode just focused on 1848 and 1849 would have been much better than what we had with Sisi in Austria, because I also feel,
or it would have been a better first episode.
Yes, the first episode, and then you have a time, lapse where we get to the royal marriage. I mean, just focusing on this, I really do feel that this was just a missed opportunity, and this time could have been spent better. I also don't feel that by the end of the episode, when the Archduchess Sophie sort of laments about the growing power of Prussia, that we even really know what Austria is, because to throw this on to to force this on a unsuspecting audience, they have no idea what Austria is or why we should even care or why it's even an empire. So I feel the obsessive preoccupation with Sisi and the Hungarian question, almost from me, is for looking at this from the point of view of someone who focuses on Austria, it degrades the whole sort of the historical sort of intrigue of focusing on Austria. And even they're just tiny hints. There are aspects of the episode that I really like, say, for example. So the final act of the episode is Franz Josef and Sisi are talking about the past is dead, we must look to the future, i.e. she's going to take over the influential role from the Archduchess Sophie, who was only looking back, fearful of what has happened in the past. And you hear this as they're playing Verdi in the background. And if, again, this is in the backdrop of the Austrians having just lost a war with Sardinia, Piedmont, and France under Napoleon III. Thus, it is hinting that we're seeing the rise of Italian nationalism. But then again, even that question doesn't come up until, I think, episode 10, and it's only referenced as Italy is an unreliable ally. Italian nationalism and the Risorgimento play virtually no role at all in the series, but they're little elements hinting at things which will be brilliant for future episodes, but they never come about. So as far as I'm concerned, the first episode, there needs to be a do-over. But regarding that question of Wilhelm in Prussia, that sort of leads us nicely into the second episode, which focuses on the creation of Germany. But again, you could say following in the tradition of the first episode, which was a homage to Sisi. With the second episode, we start off with, the episode is called An English Princess.
Just before we continue, Charlie, were you going to say something before we ended that on the first episode?
Well, this is a
Are you gonna
perfect
chime in?
segue into that, because I again wanted to
Okay.
reflect while I've been watching the show with my friends and looking at their reactions. And one of the problems in the show is it does fail to approach the problem of German unification. And I sort of had to explain the political situation with Prussia and Germany, and what's actually going on here, because they simply allude to Germany and unification, but really provide, they really should have had an episode with Bismarck dealing with that situation thoroughly, rather than simply referencing it, because for any audience who doesn't understand what happened previously to this episode, it simply fails to deliver the seriousness of the events happening.
I think the biggest missed opportunity,
exactly.
sorry, Marcus, the biggest missed opportunity, Charlie, is that Austria is the leading power in the German Confederation. And Germany is barely mentioned in the first episode, yet it is the hallmark of the second episode. So again, this is the problem when you don't have a overall sort of, they call them showrunners, a producer, director, writer, who is cognizant of what he wants to achieve for the overall product, in this case a television show, and he is instead letting the individual writers have too much freedom to diverge from what the ultimate story is, which is the dramatic fall of the dynasties. So again, if you're going to set up the German unification and the fading of Austria, you failed, and you have to come up and you have to already have some foreknowledge of what Prussia is in relation to Germany. Because you're right, Charlie, I mean, people who have no sort of recollection of 19th century continental European history aren't even going to know what Prussia is and the situation in Germany or when it got unified, etc. So you need to establish this, and instead you establish it, you can say again, through the soap opera lens of women's history, approaching this through the angle of the Princess Victoria and her marriage to the Crown Prince Friedrich, who will ultimately become the Crown Prince. He wasn't the Crown Prince in 1858.
As he's called in the show, Fritz. You know.
But this, but it is a problem, because when I first watched this series when I was 17, I really did think that this was a lefty 70s women's history thing, where they were going to be presenting this from the point of view of the royal princesses and the queens, rather than, you know, the royal families as a whole. And so you can almost say that the second episode is a continuation of the first episode in that. But halfway through the episode, probably about a third the way through the episode, it becomes very obvious that Queen Augusta, the wife of Wilhelm, is never going to make an appearance. And therefore, already you've taken a dramatic about turn from the style of the previous episode, which was almost exclusively about the relationship between Sisi and the Archduchess Sophie. I mean, it's a miracle almost that Augusta doesn't play a role, given that, again, this is about influencing the Kaiser, and how Bismarck hated the Queen Augusta and later Empress Augusta with a passion because of her supposed liberal sympathies and her vast education compared that to Wilhelm. But she's completely omitted. So from the beginning of the second episode, the series takes on a complete turn and now becomes the diplomatic military history of German unification. And out of nowhere, we have the introduction. You mentioned the introduction, Marcus, where, you know, I was removed from my post in Frankfurt for being rude to the Austrians, and, you know,
reactionary.
and he's talking to von Moltke, and, you know, he's sent off to St. Petersburg and comes out. So he comes out of the way, and, you know, Wilhelm is crying, laments the fact that he has to hire this man who is too violent, and, you know, considers the abdication. And really, from that point, can
I just interrupt you just briefly? I love the scene where Fritz has the paper and Vicky's asking, like, what's your father going to do? And Fritz basically says, well, he's going to appoint Bismarck, I'd imagine. Like, he sort of accepts the inevitability that there's no one else in Germany who can do the job.
It is slightly ridiculous, but it's also the fact that, you know, he's completely dominated by his wife, who's considerably younger than him, the Princess Victoria, who, again, the episode makes a a large emphasis the fact that she's under the influence of Albert. So of course Bismarck perceived this all as some sort of foreign plot to subvert Prussia, which is, I'm sorry, but
which is strongly
considering the Coburg plan, is actually
yeah.
quite correct.
Well, it's quite correct, and it is actually strongly demonstrated in the show that this discussion actually happens. Like Bismarck, when he talks to Holstein, or he's even talking to Moltke, will often say, but this is the work of Windsor, like not Germany, you know, like he will actually make those statements in the show. And Bismarck's sentiments were actually reflected that in real history, that he did think those things were more true of Windsor than of Berlin, for instance.
Well, yes, I mean, this is almost why not focusing on 1848 in general, I think, does a disservice to the series, and why you decide to focus so much on the Archduchess Sophie in the first episode, but you don't reference Queen Augusta. Because I think the best indication of this idea of a foreign plot, which you could actually present in the show, is playing up the angle. Like, you know, for example, Wilhelm even mentions it. They all want me to die. No one wants me as their king. Well, in 1848, there was indeed a plan for who was then King Frederick Wilhelm IV, who is the king at the beginning of this episode, but he dies off screen and is never mentioned. And of course, Wilhelm is the crown prince, being his brother. The plan in 1848, proposed by the Liberals as part of the Coburg plan, well, later it became the Coburg plan, but this was the original plan, was to remove both of them, have them renounce and abdicate the throne, and let Augusta, a Liberal, reign as regent for who would presumably be her educated Liberal son, the young Prince Friedrich, who presumably then goes off and marries a Liberal princess, in this case, Princess Victoria. All of that is omitted, but all of that would give credence to Bismarck's Anglophobia going forward in the rest of the series. So again, if you're going to play up,
or at the very least, we could describe as Anglo-skepticism.
No, I think Anglophobia is more pronounced than Anglo-skepticism. So again, if you're going to lean on this angle, then you have to really sort of follow through with it, because again, like we see with the episode revolving Sisi, this is a bit of a false start in that the fact you get to the penning of the not really even the denunciation, but you can say the rescuing of Frederick when Wilhelm decides to dissolve the Prussian Landtag, the parliament. And that sets off a series of events where Bismarck cements his control over the king and orders that in the show's dialogue that leave Fritz as a decoration and a soldier. And therefore he's basically cut out of political life, and this sets up for the third episode. But from that point of view, you've set up all of this political momentum, and all of a sudden it's all gone, and it's all on Bismarck. So again, the series, I think, needs to be consistent in terms of what it's trying to achieve. And
I love that. I love that part after the Danzig speech, which I believe occurs in episode 2, and because you mentioned the discussion between Bismarck and the Crown Prince Fritz, they have a discussion in Fritz's palace, and Fritz basically says to Bismarck, you know, I hope, you know,
my favorite quote of all time, yeah.
Well, I won't take your thunder then, but I like that discussion between them. And you know, Fritz basically suggests to Bismarck, well, we've sorted this out as men, and you know, it's all water under the bridge, and I consider the matter closed. And if you would like to echo your favorite quote, I'll leave you for all the glory.
Well, yes, he then goes on to enunciate, well, perhaps the best policy is to forgive and forget. I may forget, Your Majesty, but I never forgive, Your Royal Highness.
And Bismarck said many quotable things, and that is arguably one of the best.
Well, yes, I mean, regarding these quotes, if we're going to be very pedantic historically, all of these quotes are taken from the real history, and they are rearranged for dramatic purposes. But of course, you have to give license to that when you're condensing so much history, that Correct. All of these things weren't necessarily said at this time, in this place, to this person. Nevertheless, they occur, and it's the fidelity to the source material that matters.
Historical narrative has to work within artistic dialogue, and they have to find a synthesis that works.
It's the spirit of the history versus a one-to-one reenactment, which is virtually impossible. I mean, the only things we really leave one-to-one reenactments for are recreations of historical battles, rather than epics concerning the falls of 3 European dynasties.
Yes, quite. Very, very much so.
So we proceed from here to follow the path of German unification. And the only sort of memorable things in terms of moving the series forward is that Victoria displays in her letters to Victoria. But again, I find this a weird omission from the series. Again, I think this is just the aftermath of the first episode because it brings up so many questions. Queen Victoria was infamous, absolutely infamous, for her obsessive control over the Princess Victoria, her demands on the Princess Victoria that whilst as a German princess, she has to uphold English customs, even over, say, for example, the periods of mourning, whether they vary in England compared to Prussia. And all of this is completely omitted. Instead, we have you can say, a much more simplified iteration where Victoria is communicating events to the audience as a narrator through her correspondence with Queen Victoria, which again, I feel is another missed opportunity for leading on to this idea of the interconflict between these royal and imperial women. But nevertheless, it sets up not really the reason, or rather the event, which is the Austria-Prussian War. And that leads to I would say, a very effective scene where we talk about, well, Bismarck is feuding with the King Wilhelm over the peace policy regarding Austria. And this is actually taken from a film about Bismarck that was made by Ufa, I think, in 1940. But anyway, I mean, it basically plays out the same. Bismarck wants to have a peace with Austria that involves no annexations, simply dominance over the German Confederation. Now, in the film Bismarck in 1940, the reason Bismarck pushes so much for that policy is because he's already made an informal agreement with Napoleon III at Biarritz, and any prolonging of the war would mean a possible French entry into the war, which is a side which isn't covered in Fall of Eagles. Instead, Bismarck goes on a tirade saying, when Moltke suggests, power in Hungary and the Balkans if we annex parts of Austria, and Bismarck goes on his famous speech saying the Balkans is not worth I believe it's the blood of one single Pomeranian grenadier or something to that effect.
The healthy bones of one single Pomeranian grenadier.
Yes, and this, you can say it sets up the worst qualities of Bismarck.
Sorry, and he mentioned something, but like some passing thing about Catholic Magyars, leave them to themselves,
Oh, yes, let them keep it. Yes, regarding Hungary. So it's a wonderful scene, again in isolation, albeit the events sort of getting to that scene and the explanation are somewhat lacking. And then, of course, I mean, even you, Marcus, I know that you reference this scene a lot. I'm not sure even if it is a GIF. If
you know me too well, don't you?
Yes, I do. Sadly, when Moltke is just reviewing the fact that Bismarck has just thrown a lamp and he's weeping and professing, I will have to resign,
and about to throw himself out the window,
yeah, throw myself out a window, and Moltke is just looking completely unconvinced of the theatrics, just saying this is disgusting.
With the most like dismissive, repulsed look on his face as well. Like, this is disgusting. He couldn't be more dismissive of it.
And I think really you can say this scene is the sort of the beginning of the brilliance of Fall of Eagles, because it's been a rough start in getting us to this scene, but we finally got here where we have.
And also, just on that point too, I think this is where the power of the show demonstrates itself, in that it's well casted. I think for so few lines as he has, the actor, which is, I think his name is a Peter Henson or whatever, the actor who plays Moltke very well. The men who play the boisterous
Basil
princes,
Henson,
Basil Henson, the men who play, they don't have a lot of dialogue, but the men who play I think the brothers or the cousins of Kaiser Wilhelm, the Prussian gentlemen of the court, and they would have been generals as well in their own right, I would presume, play their roles exceptionally well. Fritz plays his role well, and Vicky plays her role really well. Episodes 2 and 3 demonstrate that this show is very, very well casted, and a lot of people in the chat have said it. You mentioned him before. I've just gone blank. The actor who played Willie as an older prince, Barry
Foster.
Barry Foster and Kurt Jürgens are just, no one could have done them better. They just fit into their roles like gloves. But just before we continue, I just want to answer someone in the chat. John No Name. Victoria displays in her letters to Victoria. We probably should call Princess Victoria Vicky, because Princess Vicky is the daughter of Victoria, and she's named after her mother. Just
Yes,
if anyone's
yes,
confused.
I think you were away, but I was talking about a missed opportunity where
Okay. Yes.
the letters to Victoria are used as
Mm.
a narrative device, when in
Yes.
reality there was a major plot point and bone of
Yes.
contention between Victoria and the Princess
Mm.
Victoria, which could
Yes.
have been
Okay.
interesting
Yeah.
had there been an angle there. But
Mm.
Victoria is introduced and presented in the first scene in this episode, and she and Prince Albert are left again, and then of course they mention the fact that I believe it's the uncles again, they're brought in, and they talk about
It's
Prince
the
Albert
it's the
having got a
bathhouse
chill.
scene.
Yes, got a
Yeah.
chill at Sandhurst.
Opening a
Um,
barracks in Sandhurst, He was never a
yes,
soldier, he was a scholar, and
I think
that
it's
said he
even
was so
worse. I think it's even
dismissiveness,
worse than that. It's
Yeah.
shouldn't have been never a soldier. Should have been a monk.
That's right, yes. And said in a very dismissive kind of way. It's just like, well, he wasn't fit enough to be a soldier, unlike us manly Prussians,
Yes, and
Yes.
this, I think, I mean, even the fact that it should be mentioned that Prince Albert, of course, is German. He's not English. Saxe-Coburg and Cotter. But nevertheless, this illustrates the beginning of German unification. And like I said, it services really as a prelude to the beginning of the series, because the final episode is referring to a very old argument which Frederick Wilhelm IV had with the German revolutionaries back in 1848. And again, this is why you need an 1848 episode to bring these two things together, because Wilhelm, rather than the presentation that ridiculous portrait we have in the Hall of Mirrors, I forget the artist, but where Bismarck is standing there all in white, and we see the proclamation of the German Empire and Wilhelm I as the German Emperor. Instead, we cut from a treatment of the Siege of Paris, and you can say the immediate souring of the relationship between Wilhelm and Bismarck. And again, I cut the film Bismarck, which was made in Germany in 1940. It has to have played on the mind of what's his name, the creator of this series, who actually wrote this particular episode, John Eliot, in tandem with Elizabeth Holford, because it's a direct repudiation in that film. The conclusion really is that scene we saw between Wilhelm and Bismarck, where they joined sides against against the King Wilhelm. Well, in this, we see the coming together and then the destruction of that relationship over the treatment of the civilians in Paris, moving on to the Proclamation of Germany, where Wilhelm is saying, I will not be German emperor. And of course, Bismarck has already said, I've already paid the German princes to go off and announce and give credence to the proclamation. It's an interesting story. It's not cited in the show, but just reasons for that.
And moreover, just for the sake of the audience too, he not only says, I won't be German emperor, but he says, I will not get my throne from the gutter. Basically saying
yes. What do you think? I think it's worse than that. I think it's, do you expect me to reject a crown of gold and replace for a crown of filth or something like that?
Something to that effect,
I have my crown from God, which is why the proclamation of the princes was necessary, because the allusion is to that of the Holy Roman Empire, and the fact that the Holy Roman Emperor was an elected position, acclaimed by the foremost senior princes and the three most senior clerics of the empire, who made up the electors. So the idea that in this case it was the King of Bavaria, Ludwig II, who was the first one and therefore the most significant one to present the idea to Wilhelm, and therefore all the smaller princes went along with it. This was to give some superficial sort of historical allusion back to the election of the old Holy Roman emperors and the creation of a new German empire. And again, in props to the series, he uses the correct name. It's not consistently used throughout the rest of the series, but he refers to himself as, I shall not be German emperor, which is the correct title, as opposed to
rather than the Emperor of Germany. Yes, indeed. Yeah. Just on that scene, because you mentioned just before about Fritz and Bismarck, about paying the princes. What's interesting is that you sort of have this dynamic between Fritz, both historically and in the show, is obviously demonstrated as being a dutiful son despite his liberal leanings, and being persistently henpecked by Vicky, that he doesn't go far enough, he doesn't push the conversation far enough, he doesn't advocate for his positions enough. The fact that Vicky henpecks him is actually very much emphasized, particularly in episode 2. But there's a very, very interesting bit of dialogue between Bismarck and Fritz, where they talk about paying the princes or whatever. Just before that, Bismarck scoffs at the prince, because the prince kind of alludes to the fact that he will become emperor one day, sort of one way or another. And Bismarck was saying he would say he says to Fritz, do you think it's going to be like in Britain? Where's it democratic and constitutional? It will never be. He's blatantly going to prevent this from being the way Vicky and Fritz want it, insofar that he is chancellor.
And this is
it's
why
very well demonstrated.
This
in
really is the prelude to the show, because this is the conflict for the third episode. And the third episode begins again with this time a very long Michael Horden introduction, where we talk about the unification of Germany. And actually for the first time showing us the titular eagles, which is something you should have shown us much earlier on in the series, referencing the Drei Kaiserbund, the League of the Three Emperors. And we're introduced to Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany, Franz Joseph of Austria-Hungary, now Austria-Hungary, was Austria at the beginning of the series, and Alexander III of Russia.
Just now that we've changed slides, can I just quickly answer a question in the chat, just momentarily?
Very quickly, yeah.
Yeah. Eccentric Tripper. Yes, Bismarck has descendants, and if you buy his autobiography, it is forwarded. We actually did this in the Bismarck stream, so if it's in the back catalog, go have a look, because I can see that you're a channel member. We talked.
Well, no,
about
it's
Bismarck.
free. That episode is free.
Okay. Anyway, yes, he can go see it in the back catalog. I read from a book that I have written by Volker Ulrich, and the forward of that book is written by one Ferdinand von Bismarck, which is Bismarck's living linear male descendant. So yes, he does. Sorry, continue. I am.
So this sets up the overall conflict of Fall of Eagles, and there are two sort of conflicts, or one sort of allusion to a future conflict shown in the episode. Austria is, I don't think, even mentioned once in the entire show, but we set up the conflict between Bismarck and the Crown Prince and Wilhelm, but also Bismarck's relationship with Wilhelm, and also Wilhelm's relationship and Germany's relationship with Russia, and Alexander III, who actually makes a visit to Germany, and it's significant enough that the show actually references it. And at this point, it also shows that the Crown Princess Victoria and Fritz, who would later become Frederick III, have been squirreled away. And Frederick is introduced. This is somewhat later. So again, as part of this documentary series, we have Michael Horden talking about Germany's growing industrial power, etc., etc., etc. So we set up after a 17-year hiatus back in 1888, and therefore focusing on the year of the three emperors, when Wilhelm I becomes German emperor, and Wilhelm I is still holding on at the age of 90. And we're introduced to Barry Foster's portrayal of Wilhelm II, the would-be Wilhelm II, and his impetuous desire to become king, often through rather creative means. And you set up the drama between the family when he is given a position in the foreign ministry, which indicates that Bismarck is actually trying to maneuver Wilhelm II to have more, you can say, investment and knowledge of the workings of government over that of his father, who is still the crown prince. There is also this hint in the show, but it never goes any further, where Bismarck actually brings in a Scottish doctor. I love the fact he's referred to as an Englishman by Bismarck.
Mackenzie, the Englishman.
Yes, Mackenzie, to treat the larynx of the crown prince, because he will die of cancer during the year of 1888. And I've always got a hint that the episode may have gone another way, where they were suggesting that Bismarck was trying to murder the crown prince by the intercession of the doctor, but it never goes anywhere. And later it's seen as some moment of reciprocation between Queen Victoria and Bismarck. And I sort of wonder what the show was trying to get at here, because what the last scene, I think, with the three together, Victoria, Frederick, and Bismarck, is showing that there is this, I would say, peace finally brought between the three. To me, I mean, could you say that this is Bismarck's recognition of the futility of the situation, that I have full power anyway, so I may make this Christian act? It doesn't seem very Bismarck of me, the fact that their relationship ends this way, because, you know, Bismarck, you know, of all the things that can be said, especially with his relationship with Augusta, which isn't cited in the show, Bismarck wasn't magnanimous in victory, so to speak. So again, I wonder what this was trying to achieve, because in any sense, he is victorious. When Wilhelm II finally, again, there were these lovely little bits where he talks about, you know, there's this old Prussian law whereby, you know, a man who cannot speak cannot rule. And Bismarck is actually defending the crown prince. He is trying to prevent Wilhelm II taking hold of the throne too soon. And I think there's even a quotation.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, you're going to touch on the quote. Yes,
You
go
know,
on.
yes, the young prince is too headstrong, or something like that. So
Oh, no, that's not what I was gonna. I thought you were gonna say something else. Wait, in actually talking to the prince himself, he says, "You may put on your wristwatch, but time will not travel any faster."
mm,
Basically, to say to the prince, "Time will take its course. You don't need to rush." Like, you're. We know that your father's in this predicament. You won't be emperor any sooner by counting the minutes. And you're quite right. And then afterwards, when I think Bismarck is presenting papers to then Kaiser Friedrich Wilhelm, who only rules, was it for 99 days or 100 days after his father? I
yes,
can't
around
exactly
them.
remember.
Yeah.
So at this point, he can hardly, if not at all, actually speak. And Victoria, the person we've been referring to as Princess Vicky, now I suppose you call her Empress Victoria, is sort of has the desk of the crown prince, or now the emperor, and Bismarck is taking papers in and out for the emperor to sign. And this is where they have actually a conversation, and Bismarck says, he sort of alludes to the fact that, and this is where a bit of conciliation does come between himself and Vicky. The relationship will never be repaired, but at least, and whether this is artistic license or historical, I don't actually know, but it's a nice touch either which way. And Bismarck alludes to the fact that he says, for all of my life, I have served the Prussian crown. I've served the emperor. I will serve his son, and after he dies, I will serve his son as well. And it's my one solemn duty as the Chancellor of Germany to do this. It's a tough thing to do,
Yes, but
and he actually thanks him for it. And that's an interesting
yes,
aside.
that's the scene I was referencing earlier. But there's another undercurrent to this, which is Victoria's own sort of lost dreams or aspirations of rulership, because she tries before then to demand that all state papers go through her.
Correct.
Therefore,
Yes.
she acts as some form of intermediary and possible, the real source of power in Prussia. And Bismarck frustrates this plan. And when Wilhelm II,
Well, he plainly dismisses it. He
yes,
brushes her aside very sternly.
and when Wilhelm II takes on the throne, it is again within the guise of trying to essentially prevent his mother from meddling in the affairs of state. Ostensibly, she has been sending letters to the throne of England, which could pose a security risk. So we actually see a palace coup upon his ascension, where what is the official palace? I forget the official palace, which would take is confusing as well because these are all
Was it
English country
Potsdam?
names. Yeah, but which palace at Potsdam?
Oh
I don't think
gosh.
it was Charlottenburg, but anyway, there was a palace coup essentially against his own mother to prevent her sending her father's papers back to England, and there we see her own sort of you can say her forlorn expression regarding her own hopes for Germany. I feel that I've seen the sort of was it the sinking of a great ship at sea with all its hopes and all of its progress, of course, indicating the futility of Prussia's own constitutional direction, but also her own recognition that she has no influence over the young Kaiser Wilhelm II, which is confirmed at the end, albeit she erroneously blames on Bismarck, because yes, Bismarck did play a role in frustrating Wilhelm II to preventing their relationship. Yet at the same time, Wilhelm II, you could say quite rightly, sort of had childhood resentment of his mother for treating him very harshly over her inability to get over the fact that he had been born with a withered arm as a result of the unfortunate birth.
Yes, which John Not Real Name does mention. There's that scene where young Willie's riding a horse, and and Fritz is actually more compassionate. He basically says, maybe we should stop now. That's enough for the day. And she's like, no, he must learn to ride the horse. And because she had that, I dare say, this sort of aristocratic British notion of the stiff upper lip, like no, he has to overcome these things.
It's worse than that.
That's a source of the breeding of that resentment that bubbles over
No, but
into
it's a
adulthood.
succession problem. It's not just a matter of temperament. It's a problem with the succession.
Correct.
She as Queen or Princess of Germany is expected to give birth to a healthy male heir, and the fact that she seemingly has failed to do so reflects poorly on her as the effective. Cece mentions
true.
this, the brood mare of the dynasty. So the fact that she has failed in this regard, Victoria emphasizes this, her mother, Queen Victoria, when writing to her. So to such an extent, again, the doctors keep assuring the princess that no, it'll heal. It doesn't heal, and as a result, Queen Victoria has to overcompensate for the disability which the young prince has. And of course, I think Wilhelm II, even in a later episode, goes back to this. My disability has made me very self-reliant. Again, almost as a jab at his mother as well for creating that emotional distance at the beginning. But Charlemagne, you've been very quiet so far. So do you want to go ahead? Hello, I think we've lost you.
Interesting.
I'm sorry, you keep cutting out, Charlemagne.
Yeah, sorry. They don't really develop this in the show. They sort of suggest that the rift between Wilhelm II and his mother is basically entirely due to Bismarck's machinations, and only give these vague allusions that it's actually related to his arm. So I think that's a sort of flaw in this episode, where they don't really adequately explain why their relationship is soured.
Yeah, I think that is a fair criticism, but the final element of this episode is the fall in the relationship between Bismarck and Wilhelm II, which is portrayed, somewhat accurately. We have the courtiers, or von Eulenburg in particular. Yes, he is directly. I had to look through the credits to make sure I was right with all the attributions of all these historical characters, but they bring up Eulenburg and they bring up von Holstein. And together, von Holstein essentially represents the bureaucratic revolt as the political officer in the foreign ministry against Bismarck. And Eulenburg represents the aristocratic opposition of the courtiers who have basically been shut out by Bismarck. So we see a perfect storm of all of these forces who are whispering in the emperor's ear, trying to enable his own personal rule. And the moment where it sort of comes to the sort of main showdown between Bismarck and Prince Wilhelm II, is over the issue of the miners' strike in Westphalia. And this is not mentioned at all in the show, but this is also a jab at Bismarck's anti-socialist laws. And even Bismarck's final attempt, which was to denaturalize socialists and members of the Social Democratic Party who would ultimately sort of coalesce in the 1890s.
Sorry to say this, Apostolic, but isn't there a scene where they're sitting essentially like in the Royal Court, or not the Royal Court, but sort of at the long table, and Willie is at the head of it, and there's one of the characters mentions about a miners' strike in Westphalia.
This is it. This is what the scene I'm talking about. Yeah, the cabinet meeting.
Well, I was going to say, then it is cited. Yeah. Or is
no. I'm talking specifically about Bismarck's own policy towards socialism.
Sorry.
In general,
yes. Sorry.
the anti-socialist laws, even the Kulturkampf and things like this. None of this is mentioned.
Continue.
But it's important because it means that Willie wants to take two totally different directions from Bismarck. One is appearing more conciliatory to the miners, but by extension to the socialists in Germany. The other, through Eulenburg and Holstein, is taking a new course. It's called a new course in German history, in foreign affairs, to oppose Bismarck and the Dreikaiserbund. And it begins with this simmering resentment of Germany, which ultimately ends in the failure to readopt the Reassurance Treaty. But again, that's omitted, curiously, again, from the series. And you could say that from the show's point of view, this is actually portrayed as some sort of petty personal dispute between the Kaiser and Alexander III, when he takes that official document, that letter that Bismarck had received from Alexander III. And I think it says something like, he is a badly brought up boy, in bad faith, in poor faith, or something like that.
Of poor faith, yes.
Of poor faith.
Yeah.
And, he just slams it down and says, I will not have it, almost crying, as he basically just says, Bismarck, you're resigning, I'll say to everyone you're ill. And of course...
But it's a wonderful scene.
It's a beautiful scene because this is...
You may retire, I'll say that you're ill.
Yes, and Kurt Jürgens just basically explodes and just slams his foot down and says, I am Bismarck. And again, it's very memorable. I mean, despite the fact that the production values are so poor, I mean, this is again the thing that needs to be noted about all of these British series in the 1970s made by the BBC. The production values are, terrible. I mean, one of the things you need to get through with the CC episode in particular, especially if you have knowledge of the film made in the 1950s, is that, I mean, the images, I mean, my own channel, I think, has better production values than this drama made back in the 1970s. But if you can get past the production values and the small sets, and you could say the rather underwhelming palace scenes, then just focus on the gravity and the portrayal of these characters and the writing. I mean, Bismarck's presence, his portrayal, Kurt Jürgens's portrayal of Bismarck, really is enticing, and it's completed with that moment where, out of desperation, the former chancellor appeals to Victoria as last form of, desperate attempt to woo the emperor back into his favor. And then she ends by saying, "We dig our own graves," having basically said that, they were responsible for the breach in relations. So it ends perfectly. And I think, therefore, it is a very satisfying episode. But you can almost say, of all the portrayals, Kurt Jürgens's and Barry Foster's is the most endearing. And of course, Barry Foster's Wilhelm II is something that we'll come back to again and again and again, because he is the most consistent recurring character throughout the rest of the series and will be the focus of the final episode of the series. But there is one thing I want to mention, a minor point. We bring up von Holstein and we bring up Eulenburg, and I just want everyone to remember those names for a moment, because the episode went out of its way to introduce these characters, and they're never brought up again. And the reason I want you to remember them is because I think the worst part of this series, in terms of linking this all together, in terms of getting rid of the CC episode or recontextualizing it, I believe the series is missing something, and it's actually pertinent to remember Holstein and Eulenburg, because it is relevant to what I'm going to suggest later on. But this is the first time you can say we actually get back to Austria. It seems rather strange after all this time going back to Austria, and this is why I think this almost should be the introduction to Austria. It's also important to note that, as with all of these things, we've moved beyond John Eliot, the overall sort of creator of the series, and we have an individual episode created by David Turner, a playwright. And this is very, I would say, of all the episodes, even von Taffer's introduction and sort of breaking the fourth wall to the audience, it looks like a play. It feels like a play in terms of all of the elements and the tragi-comedy of errors regarding the attempts to control the information surrounding the murder-suicide of Crown Prince Rudolf and Baroness Vetsera. But in this sense, it is almost of an anachronism of an episode in terms of its presentation. But nevertheless, it is quite gripping if we are to look at the series as an anthology of all these little moments of hidden history, which nevertheless, should be commented on, but have been almost completely forgotten. Like, this episode was the first time I'd even heard of the Myelin Affair. I'm not sure if either of you were familiar with it before being introduced to it in this episode.
I was,
No,
but not to
definitely
the
not.
degree that I not to the degree that I would then thereafter read about it. I knew about it sort of by happenstance, but no details specifically.
But again, it's interesting, isn't it, that, of all the royal scandals we're used to, most prominently the death of Diana, all of that pales in comparison with the details of this event, where we are talking about the suicide of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, the only male son of Franz Josef, and his murder of his mistress, who had opted to join him in a murder-suicide pact. The fact that he'd given his own wife syphilis at the same time because of his frequent affairs, that, and also he was positioning himself possibly as appealing to the Hungarians and their party in the Hungarian parliament as an alternative king to try and usurp the authority of Franz Josef. There is a lot going on here, and of course it's all surrounding this overall tragedy. And we bring back Cici, who, bear in mind, looked as if was going to be the central character of this show, and she is unrecognizable, I think, from her original portrayal in the first episode. She is, I hate to sort of say emotional as a word, but she casts aspersions very quickly and reveals this grand plot of the Vetsera family to woo and seduce the Crown Prince Rudolf and ultimately murder him. And of course, as the events, the tragic comedy of errors transpires, more and more people are aware of the events. And of course, von Taffer tries to keep it a secret, the idea that the Crown Prince has committed suicide, rather that he was poisoned, and all of these conspiracies going around about the implications as to why he was poisoned, what exactly happened here, trying to keep this a secret, whilst at the same time trying to present to the Pope at the same time that he can receive a formal burial and that he can again be buried as a Christian, that the balance of his mind, the mental balance of the prince is fundamental in terms of understanding, not just his own, not just the burial status of the crown prince, but also the prestige of the dynasty at the same time. Because if this was a premeditated act of suicide, again, it cast it just, it's fascinating, and yet we barely hear about it as an affair.
Exactly. Sorry, you go, Charlie. I'll go after. Go.
Let me say right out the gate here that I guess this is another clear example of sort of lacking a showrunner, because the episode is basically presented as a police detective story almost. You even have this, I think the police officer who is sort of running the investigation has this intro and then outro.
This is von Taffer. This is the character in the center. Just on that note, Charlie, it should be noted that we often have these, you can almost say these cameos of these various historical figures where they serve as the focus for one-offs. So in this episode, Requiem for a Crown Prince, it is von Taffer, who is the minister president of Cisleitania, or basically the council of the imperial crown within the Austrian territories, the non-Hungarian part of the empire. The other episodes to think of are, for example, Absolute Beginners, which is basically focusing around Lenin. And then we look to The Appointment, where the focus is around Rajkovsky. And then we get to Dress Rehearsal, and the focus is around Izvolsky. So this is what I mean when going back to the idea that, like the Edwardians, which was an anthology series, say, for example, focusing on Cecil Rhodes or Baden-Powell, we have these individual episodes which almost take a break from the overall soap opera drama of the series and focus on these smaller contained stories within a limited time frame and space, told by these guest characters. And this is the first of such episodes, I think.
Yes, and I would say it's well done, but unfortunately, because of the way it's told through the focus on the police aspect and the actual covering up of what is happening, it sort of fails to land the gravity of the situation, with not only the murder-suicide of the crown prince, but also his machinations with attempting to become King of Hungary. And again, the Hungarian situation is sort of inadequately explored throughout the show. So the episode is quite good in terms of the television aspects, but I don't think it conveys successfully the seriousness of the situation in terms of the Austrian Empire.
And I completely agree with you. And this is, again, the problem with looking over what was the overall aim for this series, because Russia and Prussia, after all that emphasis on Prussia and John Eliot's role, earlier episodes, The English Princess and The Honest Broker, this seems like a very dramatic about turn. And while I feel it fails dramatically as part of a serialized presentation of events, is that we barely know these characters. The characters who we have been introduced to are now played by different actors entirely. So they may as well be entirely new characters. I mean, who played Pamela Brown is gone. So is Miles Anderson as Cece and Franz Josef. Instead, we have Lawrence Naismith and Rachel Gurney. And again, she dies at the end of this episode. And therefore is never referenced again, leading to the famous quote by Franz Josef at the end, "I'm spared nothing in this world." So it's a good episode individually, but in terms of its overall significance for the rest of the series, again, you could omit this episode and nothing in the rest of the series would change as a result of it, which again, it really does seem that there were several competing ideas as to what Fall of Eagles was supposed to be. Is it an anthology or is it a soap opera? You can have both of them. You can have one series which is an anthology, one series which is a soap opera. But given the fact that these are two ideas which are being presented simultaneously, it is rather jarring, especially as you're not using characters which the audience isn't in any way familiar with. And you've already had 3 episodes to set up this episode. And this is why I come back to the first episode again and say that it was a complete waste of time, because we haven't set up sufficiently all the intrigue surrounding this. And for all the talk of Hungary, as Charlie says, Hungary is insufficiently explained in this episode, and it's virtually never brought up again. I think there's one line to it in the 10th episode, and that's it, essentially. So there's really, I mean, other than the history surrounding the event, there's very little that can be said in terms of the overall impact this episode has on the story.
Indeed, and just to buttress that point as well, there's actually, like, say for example, you look at episode 2 and 3, you can see the character arcs of Vicky and Fritz as a married couple and the heirs presumptive of the Kingdom of Prussia, and then to become the German Empire. You see the character arc of young Willie turning, from a newborn, and again the second heir presumptive to the crown prince, and then becoming emperor himself, and this character development, which is, even for those who haven't read the history, would have an idea of how these characters form and come into being in their historical context. Rudolph is, he's just the the heir presumptive of Austria, what would become Austria-Hungary, but the Austrian Empire, and then he's having this affair.
I mean, you might as well have just done
know.
a Charles Dickens and started it off saying the Crown Prince Rudolph was dead to begin with. That's all
well, actually, you literally read my mind, because that was exactly the point I was going to make. He's such a non-entity. There's no character arc that he basically is introduced. Well, he essentially is introduced almost as a dead man. Like, you see, like the 5 minutes before he commits suicide, the hunting lodge. That's literally it. There's no arc. There's no development. Like, you see, I believe is in the first episode. Is Prince Rudolph born in the first episode? I actually just can't remember.
But he's a baby, so it really doesn't matter. And again, it's not referenced his character. It's just Cece has achieved her dynastic duty. That's it.
yes. So you have baby Rudolph, literally as a child in the cot, and then episode 4, he's the prince with a syphilitic history with his mistress, committing murder-suicide in the hunting lodge. Like, there's just no meeting between. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's no character, there's no development, nothing. It's just this gaping hole that's just filled. And just what I want to say about the Myelin Affair, just because you did mention it before, is that, and you're a much better person than me to articulate the importance of this, particularly pertaining to the Austrian Empire and having a lot of Catholic subjects of many different ethnic groups, Italians, Austrians. There would be Catholic Czechs, Catholic Hungarians, Croats, whole bunch of them, right? How this quite grisly death of the sole heir of the emperor has many problems insofar of the legacy and the prestige of the dynasty of the Habsburgs. It's the relationship with the emperor as being this sort of everyone memes about, like, the Holy Roman Empire and legacy from Rome or whatever, but nonetheless, there is a legacy there. There is a very heavy burden that is drawn from a long period of time that sort of has sat on the Habsburg dynasty writ large, that sits on the shoulders of Blessed Franz Joseph, and how that relates to the Pope, and how this relates at this period of time too, where you have rising tides of nationalism and separatism and whatever. It's a very deeply complicated situation for the royal family, and I don't know, like, I think they do an okay job of representing this, certainly from like a political
this episode
standpoint, but it feels clunky as well.
This episode would work, Marcus, with a sufficient prelude to it, but it just doesn't have it. I mean, to me, like I said, one of the worst things about the portrayal of Austria is that we never understand what Austria is, what it represents, what territories it even encompasses. But we miss the formative character-defining moment of Cece, which is her coronation as the Queen of Hungary in 1867. We don't understand how the Prussian War really affected Austria, because it is 22 years after the event and things have moved on. So instead, von Taffer, again, we don't have we don't have I've forgotten his name now. Have I forgotten his name? The narrator. Michael Horden, is it? Am I correct? Anyway,
Michael Horden, yes,
Michael Horden. We don't have Michael Horden, and again, this illustrates again the lack of overall consistency in style. The fact that von Taffer is simply there relaying events to us, and he is guiding the audience through this. And without von Taffer, we would be completely lost. We need that, that character in the sort of mold of the play, breaking the fourth wall.
I was going to say, it's almost as if they felt that they got to episode 4 and they felt as if they actually had to break the fourth wall and use the Taffer character in that way in order to establish some degree of continuity, or that, to give the audience or the viewer some kind of landing, sort of narrative landing, to gain some kind of understanding of where the Austrian Empire and the Habsburgs sort of fit into the narrative story, because there's such a massive gap between the episode 1, episode 4, with no character development, no narrative continuity.
But even, you know, when he says there was a compromise between Hungary and Austria, how is the audience who is not familiar with this area of history know what that even means, or what the implications of that are?
It's not remotely fleshed out in terms of how, why, what, and consequences. You're quite right. I agree.
So moving on from this episode, which is decent in isolation, but fails within the broader scope of what the series are trying to get across, which is the dramatic demise of the Habsburg dynasty, we arrive to Nicholas. And again, it's rather consistent that we come back to John Eliot. And this is a continuation from the episode we saw with Alexander III, who was set up in episode 3, and his relationship with Germany. And this, again, you could say almost bringing back the women's history angle. This central focus on the episode here is, even though it's called The Last Tsar, the central focus is on the marriage between Nicholas and Alexandra and the unexpected death of Alexander III. Now, I suggested this to Charlemagne a while ago, that we really needed to talk about this series in reference to a particular film that came out 3 years before this series, and I think had a large impression, in extension to almost making a follow-up to the Edwardians, as to why this series was made. They didn't want to just create something that was a continuation of, you know, all of these BBC documentaries at that time, following up on the success of the Edwardian period, so late 19th century, early 20th century. But they wanted to, if anything, make their own homage, or you can say response to, the film Nicholas and Alexandra. And I say that because the portrayal of Nicholas is very different and far less sentimental and sympathetic when compared to that role. And it's portrayed here. We are not introduced to Nicholas as the loving father, having you know, recently just seen his wife give birth to their hemophiliac son. Instead, we are introduced to Nicholas, the layabout, the loafer, the playboy, the prince who is admonished by his father, who doesn't consider him a serious person, who considers his son to be a child still at the age of 26, who is carrying on an affair with the prima ballerina in St. Petersburg.
Which I have to say, that scene and the actor who plays Nicholas, I think actually does a really wonderful job of conveying that. By the way, just from a standpoint of acting and of filmography, I just think that he just does a wonderful job of portraying that sort of laid back, kind of unserious prince that's detailed in history. I just think he does a really good job of portraying that as
the actor is Charles Kay, and
that's right.
He starts off as, sorry, Charlemagne.
Yes.
Oh, I was just going to say that you know, the way they decide to portray Nicholas in the series is very good, because it's tempting to romanticize the last Tsar, you know, due to what happens to him and his family eventually. And I think it's important to actually set up the character, you know, for the purposes of the Fall of Eagles, to demonstrate how, in his case, he fails to be the leader that Russia needs going into the 20th century. So I think the show does a really good job developing his character and showing, despite his apparent sincerity, why he actually fails in.
Sorry, Charlie, you cut out after despite his parents' sincerity. Hello?
Sorry, I keep cutting out right when I choose to talk.
So despite his parents' sincerity.
Oh, despite his sincerity, in his role as Tsar, it shows why he actually fails in that role, because he's not coming into the role as a serious monarch, and I think it's good that they actually portray that and don't overly romanticize Nicholas II.
And yes, to confirm that, we have the introduction. We have his relationship. I mean, even compared to Krzeszynska, who is the ballerina mistress of his, even she is domineering over the young, carefree Tsar, who really doesn't seem to care. You know, Charles Kay's completely laid-back attitude regarding all of this, and, you know, Sergei Vetter trying to employ a little bit of politicking to perhaps position Nicholas as a would-be liberal opponent to the unshakable autocracy in terms of the manifesto of Alexander III. In terms of criticisms to levy against this episode, we are presented with the the Franco-Russian alliance as a fait accompli, when really, given how significant that event is going to be in future episodes, it really should be expanded upon as to why Alexander III decided to enter into an alliance with the French. We simply see at the end of episode 3 the antipathy that Wilhelm II shows to Alexander III. And then 5 years later, we have arrived at a situation where Russia is allied with Germany's arch rival, France. And there's nothing to connect that incredibly momentous event. There's no reading of the situation, there's no explanation, and we don't have a von Taffer type figure. Instead, we're going back to Michael Horden, who simply introduces us to the court of St. Petersburg, who drinks wine, speaks French, and attends the ballet, which again isn't sufficient in terms of really explaining, what Russia represents. And again, a little hint of the progressive leftist historian, because all of these writers are to some extent sort of leftist in some sort of persuasion or another, but again, the idea that the Tsar introduced no social reform. I mean, you should expand upon that point. If you're going to make that point as the prophet of history, which Michael Horden is essentially, in terms of the implications or stultifying effect that has on Russia, you need to demonstrate that, and you really need to expand that point. It's expanded a little bit in future episodes, but again, it's at this moment it's insufficient. And what I find rather frustrating about this whole series when it comes to the idea of documentary versus drama is the simple sort of storytelling premise of show, don't tell. Don't bring up these large sort of sweeping historical statements and then you don't expand upon that immediately afterwards. Instead, you wait for a very long time to briefly explain aspects of that to try and support your point. But it should be evidence, if you're trying to rely on the intelligence of your audience, Marcus, that these points should be self-evident to the audience rather than having this point told to them.
Exactly. Maybe, and to some degree, some of these holes, even though they shouldn't be present in a series of this expansive and that has this much duration and detail placed into it, I guess perhaps there's a point of presumptuousness as well, that people who educated throughout the 40s and 50s and I suppose into the 60s might have had a more complex education that might have filled in these points. I guess we don't know that necessarily.
Well, the reason I bring up this specifically is because Sergei Witter has an ongoing Paul Milyukov has an ongoing feud between him and this liberal lefty naive professor. And that is enough to establish the political setting in Russia and Sergei Witter's own naivete, which Sergei Witter's pragmatism, which then becomes, liberalism later in the episodes. We see a slow transition with the character of Sergei Witter. So that's what I mean, that this is unnecessary. This feels like you're just adding historical commentary to something which didn't need to be explained in the first place. The idea that, Russia needs a parliament. We need democracy. Russia's too big and too backward. Maybe in a couple of 100 years, better communication. So, that's enough in terms of demonstrating the attitude of the various reformist-minded ministers around Alexander III at the time, and Sergei Witter's own emphasis on the Trans-Siberian Railway.
I was going to say, and that brings me to that point. There's a bit of dialogue between Alexander and his minister where he's like, "Oh, railways! All you do is want to build railways," and it's definitely portrayed in that kind of obviously leftist prism, this autocratic emperor doesn't even want to build railways.
Alexander III is portrayed as a cartoon in this. Railways you always want, but also it's a very telling quote from him, which is railways are like seditious writings, makes people think they can get somewhere better. I mean, you just want to kill him at that point. You want to sort of overthrow him at that point. The great sort of Russian autocrat is crushing the head of peasants forever, and it does. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and the attitude of Alexander II actually somehow is
third.
They touch on it. Sorry, Alexander III. Thank you. Is touched on by something that Bismarck says, and I can't remember. I think it's in the at the end of episode 3, in a piece of dialogue between Bismarck and Willy, who's emperor at this point, and he says something along the lines of, you can be like the Tsar and rule through decrees, and how just
the Russian even better, rule through the trees. I think it was.
Well, like I can never work out if it's through decrees or through the trees. I've seen both in transcription, but either which way, the point comes across as this Russian, autocratic czar will only ever, blah blah blah, and it's definitely again through that left wing frame, I suppose. But it's just interesting that we both reference that because it is actually used in the previous episode, and sort of, then you move on to this episode with Alexander III, just a little bit forward timewards. And funnily enough, I think in some ways Alexander III is framed with a little bit more, more positive light in episode 3 with his dealings between Bismarck and the Emperor than he actually is in the episode dedicated to him. It's a really strange
Well, he's
kind of
portrayed,
dynamic.
he's portrayed as pragmatic in that episode. He's basically suggesting,
Yes.
I can't rely on your alliance when the emperor is in his late 80s and you're in your 70s. Things are going to change at some point, which they do. Whereas in this situation, Sergei Witter is just saying, okay, we need to improve, logistical support to prevent a potential invasion by the Austrians. Again, it's not suggested as to why the Austrians would want to attack Russia, which is why you need to reference the Crimean War or something to indicate why there is an antipathy between these nations at this point, and why the Dry Kaiserbund fell apart in the first place, which is not referenced. But if you come back to this, in response to that, he picks up a banner which has been held by, and again, it's the Duke of Devonshire's estate. I forget which hall it is specifically, but all of these locations take place in England. He takes a banner, and to demonstrate his raw physical strength, he just snaps it in front of Sergei Witter. And the indication you get, again, this is just a reactionary brute who thinks of just utilizing force whenever confronted with these issues. And it's rather telling that one figure, which is curiously absent, because later in the series, we have an almost obsessive focus on bureaucratic ministers, whether it be Trepov or Protopopov, but we don't ever introduce Nicholas's tutor and Alexander III's most important advisor, which is Konstantin Pobedonitsiev, the procurator of the Holy Synod, which I'm going to be doing a dedicated episode to in about a week's time. I think he's only mentioned in one line off screen, the procurator of the Holy Synod, but he's never named, as if to give the reactionary side of things a fair shake, because of course he was a very famous polemicist who wrote these tirades against parliamentarianism. We never get the Russian side. Instead, all we get is Alexander III stamping on the aspirations of the recently freed serfs and saying we will crush the Austrians by demonstrating him snapping a banner. It's insufficient, I think.
Yeah, just one more thing on the Alexander III thing. I do love that line too when he's negotiating with Bismarck, where he accuses the Three Emperors League of being a contrivance of Bismarck's, just like all the others. It's just a line I love out of that episode. But sorry, yes, we should move forward. Yes.
Well, yes, that's enough to just illustrate Alexander III. But again, the main absence, which is you introduce Alexander III with the Dry Kaiserbund, and you don't complete that thought as to why the Dry Kaiserbund collapsed. So, and instead, you chose it to spend time on a play regarding the Myelin scandal, which feels that this time could have been better spent, in some other realm, focusing on the relationship between the three emperors and the intractable problems between them in terms of their own respective spheres of influence, especially around the Balkans. Not the Balkans as referred to Hungary, but the Balkans as referring to the declining Ottoman Empire. But of course, this isn't referenced. But regarding the positive aspects, I mean, Charlie, you've already mentioned the more nuanced portrayal of Nicholas. And this is where we introduce Nicholas's relationship with Wilhelm, which is very important going forward because they have a very good relationship to start off with. And later this is substantiated with an episode dedicated to the Willie-Nicky correspondence. In fact, Willie plays a fundamental role in terms of matchmaking, introducing him to Alex of Hesse-Darmstadt. Again, something which you could have lent on in the series if you're trying to build up the soap opera aspect. The character of Alex is introduced in conversation with her sister Elizabeth, the Grand Duchess Sergei, who will later on be demonstrated as a monk before the Bolsheviks kill her and throw her into a pit. But this character was actually the original love interest of Willie, funnily enough, and this is why I find the women's history so funny when looking at it in hindsight, because we see Cece being the dominant character in episode 1. We see Bismarck taking the limelight away from the Princess Royal. And in the third episode, Donna, or Augusta, doesn't say a single word. I actually watched it to see if she says a single word. She's introduced, and the Kaiser basically lectures to her, but she never says a single word, which I find remarkable in terms of the overall descending importance of the emphasis on women's history, if you're going with that angle as you continue here. But here, ignoring all that, ignoring the fact that Willie had this not only crush, but actually wanted to be engaged to Alex of Hesse-Darmstadt's older sister, Nicholas is ultimately successful with this engagement. And this represents a fundamental turning point in his life in terms of his own severe conversion to Christianity, which is portrayed in this film, even though she's a Lutheran and she has to convert to orthodoxy. It indicates her, you can say, trepidation at first, but ultimately her complete sincerity when she does convert to orthodoxy as part of this marriage agreement. And of course, the moment which also acts as the chrysalis in terms of Nicholas's own transition through this series from playboy to Tsar is the death, the premature death of Alexandra at the age of, was it 40, 46, 44? 49. I can't quite remember. I think it's 49. I think I might actually have it on the screen. I just can't see it because it's not that big for me. Yes, 49. And all of a sudden, he is the Tsar of Russia. And Sergei Witter approaches him and asks him, basically tells him, Your Majesty, you are not strong enough. Do you intend on summoning a Duma or initiating social reforms, overdue social reforms? And he turns to Witter and says, I will rule in the manner of my father as an absolute monarch, holding on to the authority which was bestowed onto me by God, or words to that effect. And Sergei Witter dismissively sort of refers to him and says, then your Majesty will have to rely on miracles. Again, acting as some sort of pertinent line as to try and indicate the future events of what's going forward. But yes, Charlemagne, to go back to your original point, we have a Tsar who is under the influence of his new devout wife, Alex of Hesse-Darmstadt, who becomes the Empress Alexandra. And we see a Tsar who tentatively and then wholly embraces the imperial ideology of his father, Alexander III, while the series tries to convey that image, that idea to us, that the Tsar is insufficient in terms of being able to hold or grasp or enact this ideology on his own. That is the event, the sort of series of events which the series presents us with. I don't believe it's an entirely sufficient reading as to try and substantiate that. And the character you really need to get across as an antithesis to Sergei Witter would be Popadonitsiev, the tutor and the advisor, as to trying to inculcate this ideas of imperial autocracy in the Tsar. And as a result of that, it really does feel that from the Tsar's point of view as to why he's doing this, my father was an autocrat, therefore I shall be an autocrat. And it seems therefore quite childish coming from that rather simplistic perspective. Am I overlooking anything?
I don't think so. I think
I would
that's
just
fairly covered.
I would just say that I think this is where the series really starts to become very strong. I think the portrayal of Nicholas II is very good, and the focus on Nicholas over the next few episodes strengthens the show quite a lot. You kind of wish the Austrians had received the appropriate attention as did Nicholas, even though some of the Russian backdrop is left out, as we commented on. At least Nicholas himself really actually feels like a main character for once.
Well, Willie and Nicholas seem like main characters, and Franz Josef appears tacked on to this whole series. And this is, again, a problem with starting the series much earlier in terms of the overall chronology and deciding that you're only really going to introduce the Russians. It should be emphasized nearly 50 years after you've introduced the Austrians. And the question is why? And as a result, you have a lack of depth and relevance for the Austrian party, who do seem tagged on if you are going to build up the relationship between these parties. Then the episode takes a dramatic about turn when we come to absolute beginners. And I looked into this as to why. Because again, referring back to this film, and the reason I also bring it up is because we see so many characters. The actor who plays Bismarck actually played the German ambassador to Switzerland in that film. The actor who played Rajkovsky in Fall of Eagles plays Lenin in that film. And in this case, the role is taken up by Patrick Stewart. Again, just to indicate that this is indeed a would-be all-star cast, albeit this was before Next Generation. And Patrick Stewart actually, I believe, does very well in that role. However, Patrick Stewart is introduced as Lenin in this episode, The Last Tsar. We see the introduction of Soviet pamphleteering. We talk about Lenin's tragic backstory with the execution of his father, of his brother, his elder brother, who again he refers to as his death as useless, and this is the wrong way. Again, all quotes which are synonymous or apocryphal when talking about Lenin. And then we go to the next episode and we introduce the coterie of various subversive influences. We don't say, for example, talk about the Jewish pogroms. Instead, we bring that back and confusingly brought it up in basically an offhanded remark at the beginning of, episode 9, which makes it rather jarring. But this leads us into a whole episode dedicated to the creation of the Bolshevik Party in 1903. And because it is such an about turn, and because it is so isolated in terms of the vein of the overall series, I do wonder why so much emphasis is placed on Lenin, especially when we're talking about Germany, Austria, and Russia. And the fact that Lenin wasn't actually responsible for the first revolution. He was responsible for the second revolution and the death of Nicholas. But if you're doing a comparative approach between all of these nations, you need to bring in all of the relevant revolutionary forces. You've hinted erroneously at one revolutionary force, the Hungarians, which has gone nowhere. You haven't really hinted at any significant revolutionary forces at all in Prussia because you didn't emphasize the socialist angle. And now you're spending an entire episode dedicated to the Leninists, which again are going to bring back and form the role in a later episode. And the reason this is again going back to the anthology angle, why the season as a whole, the idea suffers, but there are individually good episodes, is because this was the work of one Trevor Griffiths, who had already written a series on basically the antics of a local Labour MP, Bill Brand, a fictionalized version of the antics of a Labour MP in his constituency. He had written a play on the Labour Party, and he had also written a play about cultural Marxism, about Gramsci, and he was also a renowned anti-Stalinist. So it seems that given the fact he was a known writer, Trevor Griffiths, and he was aware, he was known to the people at the BBC, he was given an opportunity to give you could say, realistic, and I wouldn't say sympathetic, but definitely a realistic portrayal of Vladimir Lenin, whilst completely obscuring any association between him and Stalin, because he was also an avowed anti-Stalinist who wanted to redeem various aspects of Marxism-Leninism at the same time. So it does seem that this episode, taken in isolation, is incongruent with everything else and was written to satisfy the individual writing urge, like we saw with Hugh Whitmore and the homage to the CC trilogy. This seems like a socialist writer who really wanted to tackle the subject of Lenin in isolation in a series about the fall of the three dynasties.
Yes, it's quite obvious that that's what happened, and it's the sympathies with Lenin are also obvious in how the show actually ends. If I in fact remember the ending correctly, as I've not.
That's another interesting point to talk
so
about.
We will get into that then.
We will get into that, but that's really all I have to say about the episode, because
I agree. It's an utterly jarring episode in terms of its setting within the rest of the show. We're halfway through the series now, and suddenly there's this episode. It was funny because I was watching it with my friends, and they commented on Patrick Stewart having this side role in the episode prior, and then suddenly you just get this full-blown biography of Lenin, utterly detached from anything else really happening in the show, and then it's just sort of left there on the table to be reused later. It's an excellent episode. Patrick Stewart's excellent in the role. It's just in the overall context of the show, it's a bit odd, especially to spend a full episode focusing on, given the lacking elements around Austria and Russia that we've commented on.
I have to agree, Charlie. It's almost as if I get the feeling that the emphasis on Lenin in that episode, the only actual comparison would be potentially the emphasis. If you consider, like, if you take the monarchs out of the equation for one moment, I feel that the only other character that gets that much focus over a couple of episodes would actually be Bismarck in episodes 2 or 3. I get the feeling no other character aside from the royals get as much focus as what Lenin does.
I would push back against this slightly. I mean, the only difference between Absolute Beginners, Absolute Beginners and The Appointment both include Nicholas. However, you can say, if I'm trying to give this episode the benefit of the doubt, not just say that it is a good episode about the formation of the Bolshevik Party in isolation, which doesn't really fit within the scheme of this series. The appointment almost seems like the counterbalance to that, where the appointment is the focus on the Okhrana, and the focus is on one operative, Rajkovsky, who is the anti-Lenin, who is, and again, the idea of police socialism. But again,
the
seems
subverter
from
and the anti-subverter, in a sense.
Well, again, the anti-subverter is also subverting.
Rajkovsky, I think, is sort of
True.
very much played as sort of an anti-hero or even villain, despite being the focus of the show, whereas Lenin is not really given the villain treatment, even though it's weird. A lot of characters say very negative things about Lenin in his episode, but it never really feels like the episode is actually attempting to show him in a bad light.
No, the show demonstrates, Patrick Stewart demonstrates him having, bouts of illness where he is focusing on trying to hold the socialist movement together and prevent this fracturing of the movement, which happens as a result of the machinations and the Social Democratic Conference and the creation of the Bolshevik Party. But again, he's very much seen in a tragic light. He doesn't want to do this. He doesn't want to breach with his friends, such as Julius Martov. But nevertheless, he has to go this way in order to overthrow Russian autocracy and create a party which is sufficiently galvanized in the vanguard, which can actually affect revolution, rather than presenting a mass movement, which the Menshevik faction wishes to present. So again, it does seem rather sympathetic. And when we get to Rajkovsky, if anything, just seems like another attempt to show the dark underbelly of the Tsarist regime by demonstrating all of these sinister characters, albeit brilliant characters, who are sustaining the Tsarist regime through a system of arbitrary sort of, you can almost say government-sponsored terrorism and all manner of sort of police contrivance, which leads us, the Okhrana, to the Cheka, KGB, NKVD, etc. So it does seem that the betrayal of Nicholas is that of a hapless Tsar who is brought into the sphere of reactionary repression, whilst Lenin, again, is struggling valiantly to oppose that. And again, it makes sense if you look at the writer and what his overall sort of backlog is of writing and his overall impressions, that he's trying to create a Lenin which is distant from that of Stalin. But the next episode, again, to talk about jarring, comes back to the Willie-Nicky relationship. And you could say it's one of the best episodes in this. It sets up the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. And it also demonstrates the depth of the relationship and collaboration between these two partners through the correspondence there, where again, even just the affectation, Willie-Nicky. And you have these wonderful little moments where Wilhelm is talking about this titanic struggle between Western civilization and Eastern semi-civilization, and he brings up the Yellow Peril, even though we don't have the Hun speech, which would have been given earlier during the Boxer Rebellion. Again, curiously omitted, but maybe you could reference that in some part. And he's creating this ridiculous painting, this allegory of Kaiser Wilhelm sort of standing over a rather docile Nicholas II, who is holding back the tide of this new sort of Asiatic threat and saying, oh, it was designed by myself, executed, of course, by Herr Krakvus. It's just wonderful in terms of the back and forth in this and the building up of the sort of relationship between that. And of course, it culminates with the summit at Bjorko. And in terms of, again, the presentation of Willie's character at the height of his confidence, where he's talking about the possibility of a Russo-German alliance, and his thinking is Russia joining to Germany, by extension, will be joined in alliance with France due to the already existent the Russo-French alliance, and then, of course, bring in Austria in that pact. This is, you can say, Willie's attempt to bring Russia, using the tragedy of the Russo-Japanese War, into Germany's orbit, distancing themselves from Britain, who is very much presented on both sides as the antagonist in this party. And we get to Bjorko, and we see this. It's even told through Willie's own sort of presentation and narration, where he's giving these ridiculous melodramatic pronouncements where, I can't remember exactly how it goes, but it is, history was made on this occasion. And then the next scene is, forget it ever happened, Your Majesty. Hello?
Yeah, sorry, I just wasn't prepared to jump in there. Yeah, I agree that this is one of the better episodes in the show. It's certainly my favorite thus far, having rewatched up episode 9. I really like the way um, Willie is portrayed and the relationship between the two are developed. The scene at the end of the episode where Willie is sort of recounting how he got the Tsar to agree to the treaty was quite amazing. I think this is sort of a culmination of two of the best portrayals in the series, and it's very enjoyable.
Charlie, because you've actually watched this more recently than me, I happened to have watched this a couple of months back, hence why I haven't rewatched it. But is this the episode, or even you might know Mr. Majesty, but is this the episode where Willie curiously sends his cousin these paintings of him, like of all these strange?
I was just explaining that, Marcus.
Oh, okay, yes.
I feel a bit offended now. I'm joking, not really. No, I was talking about the design of these ridiculous paintings of fighting off the Asiatic menace and being executed.
Oh, sorry,
by
yes.
So my friends and I were
wasn't
actually
there specifically something like about more like he was actually setting like increasingly ostentatious and just Nick was almost getting sick of this?
Oh, there was one. Yes, there's one moment where he signs off as I hope the Admiral of the Pacific doesn't ignore the Admiral of the Atlantic's signals, and in response to that, Nicholas and Alexandra just burst out laughing.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Sorry, go Charlie.
We were also trying to discover whether or not the paintings actually shown in the series are real or not, and I couldn't actually. I remember doing this the first time I'd watched the show. I could not actually discover Wilhelm II's actual paintings. I don't know.
Sorry, you cut out again, Charlie. Sorry, it's always the most crucial point.
Well, I'm not sure if Wilhelm II's paintings that are shown in the show, the actual paintings, do they still exist? I've tried to look this up both times watching the series.
Oh, I've tried to look them up as well. I found images of the paintings shown in the show, but again, as to their provenance, no, I actually don't know whether they are the original ones. I doubt it somehow. But nevertheless, as to whether these paintings existed, yes, they were probably destroyed or lost, given the effects of the Russian Revolution. But and also, I say, given the quality of them as well. I mean, it does seem that from the ones presented in the show that they are of quality to be expected of something which was slapped together by a local BBC artist to try and present this as something. Also because it is basically a facsimile, or sorry, it is a collage of two paintings, one of Nicholas, a photo of Nicholas, and a painting of Wilhelm smashed together. So no, I very much doubt it's the original. It really does seem that this was a BBC artist taking liberties to try and recreate this original image. But I'd be very surprised if it was the original.
Okay, that was my assumption as well. I was just curious because the show makes a point to suggest that Wilhelm's paintings are not very good, and what is shown is pretty awful as well.
Just as a quick point before we move on, because I like to touch on these things. I love how a lot of these things that are made around a similar time frame have actors that act in very different things. And yes, Murdialulu, 81. Yes, Father Gapon's the actor Kenneth Colley is indeed Admiral Piet from Star Wars. And it's actually funny having grown up with Star Wars and having loved like the original series, and then going back and watching this as an adult. It's like, oh, that's you sort of identify the character rather than the actor. This is like, yes, it is indeed the man who plays Admiral Piet is Kenneth Colley. It was interesting seeing him as Father Gapon.
Well, in terms of other events that are happening in the episode, obviously you mentioned Father Gapon, Marcus. I'm sort of worried that you're going to sort of phase out when I start speaking again, based on the previous.
No. Actually, no. To be honest with you, sorry, I'm just being inundated with messages because obviously I don't want to divert the stream, but let's just say recent events in the world, and I'm just getting inundated with messages. So pardon me.
All right.
But I would add here too, since we're touching on Gapon. The show is not particularly kind to the church in any context in which it's presented. In the Rudolph episode, the church is dealt with rather easily, and then here.
Sorry, Charlie, you cut out again.
No.
Just to sort of complete that point, hopefully we'll get you back at some point, Charlie. I mean, the church's reference, I mean, I almost feel that the only sort of reason for the portrayal of the church at all, other than the practicalities of the burial, the Christian burial in that episode, is again to almost illustrate the fact that the Kaiser, the Emperor of Austria-Hungary, is Catholic, which isn't something that's even been sort of illustrated before. I mean, we don't even find out what religion Wilhelm is. It could only be assumed Protestant, but it's never actually stated his relationship with the church in the film because it's not basic, sorry, in the series, because it's not seen as relevant. But when we get to, I mean, the portrayal of the church in this episode is odd. First of all, this is the first time where we really get inundated with, I would say, a very, compared to everything else, I would say a very unsympathetic portrayal of Alexandra. I'm not sure actually whether to say it's as a result of the actress or not, but increasingly throughout the show, she is portrayed as unhinged and rather disturbed. And that's fine to some extent, but there's not portrayed with any sort of sense of, I would say, empathy or subtlety regarding the character. And also her sort of grandstanding religiosity. And I mean, there's even a character who comments on this, the Grand Duchess Anna Pavlovna, who says her autocratic manners and her middle class morals. Yes, that's very much the impression that comes across in the character. Nevertheless, I do feel that Alexandra was done a disservice here, and again, it's due to her parochial sort of obsessive desire to canonize a hermit, Seraphim, during this series, almost to the detriment of everything else which is going on in Russia. And then also we see the birth of the young prince, the Tsarevich Alexis. And I mean, in the scene you also see softer moments with her where she talks about her lack of popularity, therefore indicating a hint of self-awareness. Nevertheless, this also ends where we talk about the growing mood and hostility. We introduced Father Gapon originally and the March on St. Petersburg. And here it is she who is presented as the one to order reinforcements in St. Petersburg, which acts as the prelude to the massacre. So by extension, she is the one who is responsible for the Bloody Sunday massacre through the deployment of troops and Cossacks. I believe there's even a quote from Tsar Nicholas that the presence of cavalry will have a calming effect. The actual procession of events in Bloody Sunday is not demonstrated. The only sort of other sort of major demonstration of this I can think of is the film which this film is obviously referencing, which is Nicholas and Alexandra, where it shows guns which would have been anachronistic for that time being fired off on a procession of people. And it's almost hinted at with this image we see in the center here. Nevertheless, the actual sort of Bloody Sunday massacre was a series of scuffles and, you can say, altercations with the vast crowd throughout the entire city of St. Petersburg. There wasn't one massive standoff and guards standing there and firing. And nevertheless, again, when we see at the end of the episode, again, trying to portray Nicholas in a very unsympathetic light, where we talk about the emperor basically being given essentially an assembly of loyal peasants who are allowed to enter the palace, and he simply talks down to them again like a teacher, saying, you know, one doesn't sort of present a petition when one isn't given permission, otherwise it will compel the authorities to use force. And why I find, again, this is rather jarring is that when we get to the next episode, his tune is completely changed. And he is now talking about, it was my responsibility. People came to me presenting a petition and were gunned down for their trouble. And again, it just indicates the disparity between the writers. Jack Pullman is responsible for this, and he, again, like John Eliot, is one of the main people responsible for the series. But the next episode, The Appointment, is written by Troy Kennedy Martin, and therefore there isn't a consistent characterization between that, especially when we get to the next episode and we see that scuffle, that accidental scuffle between Nicholas awarding medals for the heroes of the Russo-Japanese War, and he kneels and they all sort of congregate around him, and he's like, I love my people and they love me. So again, it's these little moments you wonder what happened in between to get your character from this point to this point, where first of all you're looking at this as a matter of protocol in the most cynical, stupid way possible, and now you're presenting it as a cause of self-martyrdom in the case of I was responsible, the blame fully squares on me.
I guess
Yeah,
it's another example of a narrative hole, right, in this show. Sorry, go, Charlie.
There's a clear struggle between the writers over the portrayal of Nicholas II, whether or not he's a sincere, good, but ignorant and underprepared monarch, or a sort of very reactionary tyrant. You sort of get a little bit of both, and I guess in the overall sum of his portrayal, I think it somewhat balances out, but it is quite jarring to the viewer to be presented with these two dichotomies back to back.
And this leads on to, I mean, you can say a very elongated study of 1905, because we've actually spent 3 episodes focusing on 3 years from 1903 to 1905, and this culminates with the appointment, which I alluded to as the sort of the counterbalance to the episode Absolute Beginners, which was focusing on the Bolshevik-Menshevik conflict. Well, this episode, the appointment, focuses on the Okhrana and the machinations of police socialism, and the way in which invariably people like Father Gapon were police agents, very well-paid police agents, and people like Rajkovsky were in collusion with various agents, such as the assassin who blew up the Tsar's uncle, the Archduke Sergei, the husband of Elizabeth of Hesse-Darmstadt, who, of course, is the sister of Alexandra, the Empress Alexandra. But again, it just little things which one wonders, this is the thing which sets off the episode and the creation of this post. And there is so much emphasis placed on this one individual appointment. You can say it is a microcosm, a story of the overall response to the Russian Revolution. And I find it interesting that rather than focusing on Stolypin, they focus on the figure of Rajkovsky. What sort of historical researchers were giving you this emphasis to focus on this character? And I do wonder whether it is the desire to focus on the dirty dealings and the grey morality of the Okhrana and its relationship with the Tsar, because there are many interesting things which are brought up in that episode. I mean, he is seen as part of a cabal of right-wing reaction. I mean, this even Sergei Witter talks about this, that his appointment will be seen as a collusion, or a point to the right. And then you see generals like Trepov saying it may be necessary to remove Nicholas and put Nikolasha, the Grand Duke Nikolaevich, on the throne. These are all very interesting things, but again, this is an isolated story, and none of these things really go anywhere. I mean, even at the end of the episode, to justify the existence of this episode, Rajkovsky talks about the idea of revolution, and he calls it, of course, literally the turn of the circle. And the appointment there, the sort of purpose, therefore, of the episode is to almost indicate that Rajkovsky was responsible for the prevention of the 1905 revolution turning into a thing which could have possibly overthrown the Tsar. And by extension, his absence, his death, which is told in the show, was in part responsible for the success of the 1917 revolution, which is a very interesting angle, especially given the fact you virtually omit Stolypin in his domestic role. So yes, that's what I have to say in terms of summarizing this episode.
Yeah. Sorry, go, Charlie.
Oh, I don't think I have anything in particular to add there. It was a little odd, I suppose, when it was mentioned that his appointment would be seen as a view to a right. It was a little jarring to see the term even used, because the show hasn't really commented much on this point in terms of left and right-wing politics in really any of these countries. So it was a little weird to start to see that come up in the show, but not really be elaborated on, right? It could have been, as you were saying, basically, that was a point that could have been elaborated on, but it was just sort of, like many of the things mentioned, it's sort of just thrown in there as a one-off and not really talked about.
There's another thing going on in this episode, which is it's almost like a day in the life as well, not just focusing on the appointment, but a day in the life of the royal court, because this episode happens event after event. We see the Tsar's schedule on that particular day. We see Trepov organizing the heroes of the war, and the Tsar has to break away from his interview with Rajkovsky to attend this awarding of the medals. At the same time, the Tsar is indicating that my support isn't sufficient. You need to mend bridges with the Empress at the same time. So it's a look into how the Empress Alexandra interferes in the business of government, even down to the individual appointments of certain people, that she, again, supposedly needs to be on good form with these people in order for her husband to ever go. And again, it demonstrates, you could say, the all-pervasiveness of her influence on the Tsar. And why I think this is quite good is that it introduces two things. It introduces the fact that Rasputin isn't a one-off. We get introduced to a French faith healer, Philippe, who Rajkovsky was responsible for removing. But at the same time, we see, given the all-pervasive nature of the Empress's influence over appointments, that then plays a role in a later episode. So it's a rare case, actually, where we have different writers, and yet the themes which are elucidated in this episode are then built on in a later episode, albeit with slightly less success when we talk about Tell the King the Sky is Falling. So this episode, I think, justifies, despite being part of this series of the episode anthologies, it justifies its existence, I believe, by teasing out these various aspects, and I believe by elucidating another side of Nicholas II, rather. And this is where I want to bring up the other episode I mentioned earlier, and I wanted to bring up Eulenburg, and I wanted to bring up Holstein, because the next time we are introduced to Willy, he is effectively a broken man, and he has a bit part in an episode called Dress Rehearsal, which is talking about the Bosnian annexation and subsequent crisis, the Balkan crisis of 1908 and 1909, which again, like Rajkovsky, this is portrayed through the Russian Foreign Minister Izvolsky. In that episode, would be in 1909, Willy is portrayed as weak and uncertain, and there's even a quote attributed to him that they'll all blame Germany and they'll all blame me, or something like that. And again, in terms of the dramatic sort of decline of Willy, at the end of Dearest Nicky, the Willy Nicky episode where we talk about that correspondence, it ends in Willy's triumph. And 4 years later, Willy has none of his brash self-confidence. And this is going to be something which is the focus of future episodes as well, when we talk about the Secret War and the Endgame. But it's never explained as to why Willy, apart from, I think, a very brief moment in the episode The Indian Summer of an Emperor, where Willy talks about the response to the Serbs and the beginning of World War I. Other than that, he is basically portrayed as dour and depressed. And that is because you're missing the Eulenburg scandal and the Daily Telegraph affair. Get rid of the CC episode and have an episode dedicated to the Eulenburg scandal and the Daily Telegraph affair, where we see Hardenberg and the revelations, supposedly, of a coterie of homosexual ministers around Wilhelm implicating Eulenburg. And then we put it into this, bring up these characters who are already established, Holstein and Eulenburg, and make it an episode of the contest of power between Eulenburg, Holstein, and by extension von Bülow, who is the chancellor and the foreign minister at this point. Talk about the Liebenberg Roundtable, talk about Wilhelm being dispossessed of his loyal coterie of supporters and this revelation of homosexuality, and the damning impact this has in German media on the image towards the emperor and his own self-confidence. Compound that with the Daily Telegraph affair, where he essentially blows his international prestige by going on this rambling tirade against Britain, saying, "You English are mad, mad, mad as March hares." All of this will be interesting in terms of representing the decline of Wilhelm II, which is presented in that episode, the dress rehearsal, when we next see Willy, but is never explained at all. Even someone is mentioning in the chat, I was wondering what this is. It's very weird. And this is why you're missing a crucial aspect of this. And what I find, just talking about the 1970s and the BBC, this was a moment historically where a lot of historians were wondering to what extent World War I could be blamed on the idea that Wilhelm could be a repressed homosexual, as ridiculous and reductionist as that sounds. So why wasn't there someone who wanted to tell that story?
Well,
it's
funny because in the episode we were watching, it's basically suggested kind of heavily that
Yes, Nicholas and Willie, there's something more going on, even in that sort of melodramatic emphasis and him looking at his body language and the fluttering of his eyes. It's something rather suggestive about it.
Yeah, he says Nikki's dreamy eyes or something like that.
Yes, I know.
It's very weird. But then this is just never elaborated on.
Another thing that worth mentioning too, just for the sake of reference, because my mind just blank. The Daily Telegraph crisis, or whatever you want to call it. What year was that roughly? Do you remember?
The reason I say this would have been in October of 1908, the same month in which the Bosnian crisis happened. So this would have been perfect time-wise in terms of breaching that gap between 1905 and 1908. And it doesn't happen.
Yeah, I was going to say a chatter just literally read my mind. Mary DeLue again. Yes, because I was going to mention, let's also not forget the Tangier crisis and the Agadir Affair and the German ship, the Panther.
The reason I'm
all that is totally overlooked as well.
The reason I can wave that away slightly is because at least you focus on one of the major incidents. And to the extent that you don't need necessarily to focus on all of them, you focus on the Bosnian crisis and you tease it as the dress rehearsal, even though I think that's a bit simplistic. But in terms of really explaining the actual, because this is a character study, we're talking about a soap opera here, and we're bringing back characters who have already been introduced. And I do have to wonder why, also given the sort of political context in which this was written, why there wasn't an urge to, again, not even just tease it, not state it, but just tease at this idea. And again, as Charlie said, build up on these weird insinuations, suggestions that Willie had made earlier. Because for the record, Wilhelm II, as far as I'm concerned, was not a homosexual, but it was the assumption that he was that damaged his reputation, and the idea that his guards were all homosexuals. So it's a fascinating, and again, if you're going to focus on Myelin, why not focus on Eulenburg, given that this is far more pertinent to the characters you've already established? And again, this is why I have to blame the presenter, the producers and the directors, and say that this is indicative of a lack of overall focus and trying to establish some continuity and overall connection between the writers. So that is the episode that never happened, which brings us on to the dress rehearsal and a very weird introduction to Stolypin, who is not, it doesn't look like Stolypin historically, is a cantankerous old man who just waves his, basically just says to Izvolsky, we can afford no adventures. And again, this is the man who was known as, Nicky's hangman. This is the man who crushed the revolt, and he's portrayed as some cantankerous old fart. I always wondered why they even bothered introducing Stolypin at all, if this was going to be his role in the series. But nevertheless,
and certainly with that particular framing.
Yes, with that particular framing. But nevertheless, the dress rehearsal is interesting because it approaches something which everyone learning in school about the causes of World War I will know about, which is the Bosnian crisis. Many people just know that Austria did something which caused the Russians and the Serbs to be pissed off. That's basically the extent to which people learn about it in school, if they learn about it at all.
And that's if the Ottomans themselves reference actually lost the province,
But what is fascinating about this episode is that it teases, again, this is why you really need to focus on Russia and Austria before, in order to really elaborate the significance of this. It focuses on a brief détente between Russia and Austria over the opening of the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus Straits in return for Austrian annexation of a territory which they had already occupied since 1878. And from both the view of Aehrenthal and Izvolsky, this was simply a fait accompli. From Izvolsky's point of view, this was simply the culmination of the Anglo-French Entente, and by extension, the Triple Entente between Russia, Britain, and France.
And to be more pragmatic, to a formalization of what was already the case on the ground, as it were. Like you said, this had been the situation, the status quo for 30 years.
But also, it was a way of Izvolsky to demonstrate to the Tsar, who was very, again, suspicious of an alliance or a pact with Britain, especially considering the previous episodes where Britain is portrayed as the main antagonist to both Russia and Britain. Therefore, it's interesting that they try to present Izvolsky as trying to earn the Tsar's favor by basically suggesting that the advantages will flow from this, and the advantages being access to the Dardanelles, the Bosphorus, and possibly by extension, the dream, which is Russian influence or possibly even ownership or control of the city of Constantinople. But therefore, I find this episode fails in regard to, again, the weird portrayal of Stolypin in the end, which is, why does the Tsar come down so hard on this agreement and to the end, and Stolypin's confused way of thinking, when Izvolsky has actually proven that the Entente has failed to deliver the goods, which I find very strange. And therefore, it sort of degenerates as an episode from that point on to talk about Izvolsky's own being compromised by his secret agreement with Aehrenthal and the fact that he sold out Bosnia-Herzegovina with the explicit demand that there would be no compensation given to the Serbs, which from Izvolsky's point of view was a peripheral matter. The Serbs were of secondary importance compared to the Russian maritime access to the Mediterranean Sea, which had been their principal goal, say, of foreign policy for the last sort of 80 years, if not before then, all the way since the Alexei Orlov revolts in Greece in the 1760s. So it's very interesting, but again, in terms of the overall implications of this, but also especially calling it the dress rehearsal, given that the July crisis and the Bosnian annexation were not synonymous at all. I find this rather, you can say, teleological in terms of the presentation of history, as in, I think this is actually spelled out almost exactly when we get to the end of the episode. We introduce Edward VII. Edward VII is talking to Grey. Interestingly enough, Grey is never brought up again, despite his role in the beginning of World War One. And Grey basically says, oh, well, because of this, Russia, Britain, France are closer than ever. That's a comfort. And then Edward VII prophetically says, haven't you just drawn the battle lines of Europe? And then Edward Grey says, oh, hopefully not, sir.
Yeah, I do rather dislike the way that is presented, as if this is sort of some sort of historical inevitability. Yeah.
I mean, you can say that. It's fine if you're presenting it as a tragedy, as a fiction, as a documentary, but as a documentary, it's unsatisfying to portray historical events as fixed in this regard, and the dress rehearsal is some sort of inevitable prelude to the war. And as a result of this, I feel they believe that the causes for World War One were sufficient in that episode to completely omit the July crisis, which is bizarre to me. And this comes on to the next episode, The Indian Summer of an Emperor, which is weirdly
absolutely. And just if we may reference to a conversation we had earlier on in this video, is that you watch, say, 37 Days, which goes through in almost painstaking detail all these factors that led up to the war, and for them just to omit that, like you say, just thinking that, oh, the battle lines of Europe were drawn in 1908 is a sufficient starting point to explain World War One, is actually incredibly insufficient. It's funny you mentioned that, because it's quite true, and that jumped out at me when I watched it the first time, but I had forgotten that. But you raise a very good point.
Well, it's not just, it's, you could say, historically disingenuous. I would say it's blatantly false, especially because something else which this episode fails to do, because of the single-minded focus on the disgrace of Izvolsky. This episode doesn't explain the motivations really for both the French alliance, and now it is insufficiently proven the reasons for the English quote-unquote alliance as well, which makes this all the more frustrating going into the causes of World War One. And as a result, I feel this series has to be understood as a soap opera in terms of the relationship between the royal families, or as an anthology, because when you try and explain it as a historical progression or a history of these events and the reason why these empires fall, it is insufficient, because the causes for World War One and the switch in alliances and Russia's, even Tsar Nicholas at the beginning is just lamenting, I don't understand the benefit of alliance if all it'll produce is the British questioning us about how we treat our Jews. But again, presenting Nicholas in the most simplistic anti-Jewish light possible, again, to elicit a certain response from the audience against him. It just seems, again, insufficient. And it's interesting as a one-off to portray these events through the eyes of Izvolsky, through a lens in which many people will not be accustomed to this, which is the Austro and Russian foreign policy lens. But it's insufficient in regard to the round.
Yes, exactly. And just with that point that you mentioned about Nicholas II, that quotation that is in this episode, it just does demonstrate that a lot of the shall I say, these sentiments that were held by these people in real life, as nice as wonderful as this show is, and the good qualities that it does have, it will always show those points in the lowest resolution possible, and it'll sort of use them as a means to just caricature certain characters in the way that this show wants to. It's always something to be aware of.
I wouldn't necessarily say it's a matter of low resolution. I'd probably say it's the opposite. It's extremely high resolution. It's a matter of not being able to see the wood from the trees. You're showing these situations with almost microscopic attention to detail, down to the individual meetings between Aehrenthal and Izvolsky, two people which 99% of the audience would never have heard of before embarking upon this episode. And as a result of it, you lose sight of the overall aims of all of the powers involved in this struggle. Even Austria to an extent, because there's one line, and again, the whole Jewish thing. Why bring up the Jewish thing so prominently in this episode if you're not going to lean on the pogroms committed by the Russians?
Yeah, that was weird. There were a lot of references to Jews in the episode, and in fact, Ivolsky he actually
that awful Jew. I mean, it's
he says he got a word that rhymes with screwed basically, by Aehrenthal, and I guess one thing the episode does do well is present Russia as this incredibly weakened state due to the Russo-Japanese War, and also getting geopolitically screwed here, and sort of its inability to actually act with force on the European stage at this point. Unfortunately, I did have the pleasure of discussing the show a bit with Mr. Hat last night, and he did reveal to me that
Sorry, you cut out again, Charlemagne, again, just at the moment where you're about to reveal all the interesting ingredients of your conversation.
You said something about Mr. Hat in your conversation and ... Charlie?
All right, what?
Mr. Hat did mention that this was his favorite episode to me, so it's unfortunate that he's not here to talk about it. I will say another good thing the episode has going for it is well, it does sort of give you some actual insight into the backroom politics of the foreign ministers at this point, which none of the other episodes really do. The foreign ministers are characters around the monarchs, but this episode happens to focus on two of them much more than any of the other episodes did, and I thought that was definitely interesting.
Yes, the only episode where you can really compare this is the other episode actually written by Jack Pullman, which is Dearest Nikki, where we talk about Nicholas II's relationship with his own foreign minister, and we talk about Wilhelm's relationship with von Bülow, and even his editorializing of the official correspondence down to little details like that. So it seems to be Jack Pullman's strength in this regard that he's so immersed in terms of this understanding of the diplomatic situation in Europe at this time, and for that it's interesting. However, this is also the question I bring about Aehrenthal. Aehrenthal is portrayed in this episode as very, above board, very pragmatic thinking. He's only concerned with the legalistic facts of the situation. He's not interested in any Serb irredentist claims to territory which they've never owned, only over aspirations of Serb nationalism, etc. However, in a later season where he's talking this through, and again, it's interesting how this episode shows that Aehrenthal is keeping the emperor, Franz Josef, completely abreast of everything that's going on, and Izvolsky is doing this completely in the dark with no knowledge from Stolypin or the Tsar, as if to present that counterbalance between the two. Nevertheless, Franz Josef asks, what is your reading of the situation regarding the opening of the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles? And Aehrenthal says, I believe Izvolsky has made a miscalculation, but it is up to me to make my deductions and for him to make his. And I'm not sure whether it's the actor, but there's some sort of very sly, sinister sort of insinuation there, as if Aehrenthal has deliberately set up Izvolsky to fail. And that has, major implications in terms of the sincerity of this detente between Russia and Austria. And given the fact that Austria, as mentioned, basically spelled out, narrated to us by Edward VII at the end, Austria has gained some obscure provinces in the Balkans, and as a result of it has earned the eternal antipathy of Russia. So one wonders, because of, you could say, the lack of direction or lack of explicit sort of mention in this episode, lack of clarity, whether this was the intended result of Aehrenthal or whether he failed as much as Izvolsky. whether this was sincere or whether this was a trick, because Izvolsky is very much of the opinion that he was tricked into the situation once he finds out that he does not have the confidence of the Tsar and he's betrayed Russian public opinion. So I'm leaving this episode with a lot of sort of questions which haven't been sufficiently answered and will never be answered because we don't get a revisitation of this topic, because Arental dies in the interim, Izvolsky is forced out of power, and we never cover the July crisis.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Because, like you say, it's very much established by the end of the episode that the Russian foreign minister definitely feels a sense of betrayal, and certainly as if certain sentiments within the Austrian court have been concealed, in terms of what the Austrians' true aims were, or that they weren't willing to reciprocate with the Russians, and that there isn't a further uncovering as to how this understanding. And I mean, we've actually covered this in our history streams. Like, you think of what was the plan? What was it? The Eastern Plan, whatever, between Catherine the Great and her Austrian counterpart. The Great Plan. This goes back to before even Napoleon. Some kind of resolution of the Balkan issue between Russia and Austria. I mean, this isn't something that materialized out of the ether. This is a long-standing policy or a long-standing vision of these two empires in this geography, and it's just not uncovered. There's this Bosnian issue, and then, as you say, Arental dies, and then there's no more elaboration. And then, of course, with the July crisis being completely overlooked by this show, it's never delved into.
Well, this is the only episode where Austria and Russia really deal jointly together at all.
Yes.
Because the next episode, Indian Summer of an Emperor, is mainly a focus on you can say, again, going back to the appointment, a day in the life, except it is a day in the life of the Emperor Franz Joseph, and it talks about his rigorous work regimen, getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning, his long-standing relationship with, is it Katerina Schwart? And again, it's a very slow episode. You bring in slowly these characters such as Comrade von Herzendorf. You bring in the idea that there is this antipathy between Franz Joseph and his heir, Franz Ferdinand. And again, you really sort of need to build up this before, because, again, what was the point of Myelin? We've arrived at this situation that all that's happened is he has a different heir, which he already doesn't like. It was the same situation in Myelin. Very little has changed and very little has set this up. However, what is set up is that there is a friendship between Franz Ferdinand and Wilhelm. And the reason I like this scene, even though it's very short and Franz Ferdinand is, has barely any sort of presence in the show, is that it's sufficient to bring up a lot of questions regarding Austria as a whole, which hasn't really been addressed at all, which is what Austria is for and what Franz Ferdinand wants to do about Austria. And he talks about the creation of a United States of Austria akin to that of America. He talks about his devotion to the Countess Sophie Chotek and how he will go to bat over her, despite, again, being forced into this morganatic union where, I mean, it's not even mentioned that his children won't inherit the throne, the extension to which this has alienated his relationship with Franz Joseph. But it's enough to establish his character and the relationship between Franz Ferdinand and Wilhelm. And this, it should be illustrated, is really the first time that Wilhelm has ever dealt with Austria at all. It's only taken 10 episodes to get to this point.
Yes, and despite the fact that these two nations have fought a war with each other and everything, yes.
It is quite fascinating, but it's a tiny little sort of introduction to the character of Franz Josef, but also it bears attention, what have all the other episodes really achieved at this point? Because it's a very intimate portrayal, and we are told through Katerina Schratt that the emperor has suffered tragedy, that he's lost his brother in a Mexican prison, that he's lost his wife to an Italian anarchist, that he's lost his son to a murder-suicide pact. And the fact is, I was just thinking, reflecting on that scene, you could have just had that and everything else could have gone, and we'd have lost nothing in terms of the overall sort of sweep of the series, in terms of how poorly Austria has sort of been treated up until now. And even the question, your brother was shot in a Mexican prison. are you going to elaborate on why that was? Yeah, but just as an audience
Yeah.
member, just
It's just
listening
a
to
hint,
that.
and it's
Yeah,
like,
and
oh,
all,
there you go,
oh, yes, he was briefly made the Emperor of Mexico, and
mere side point,
mere side point. It doesn't really matter, but it's just these little things, that tiny little scene, that intimate scene between Katerina Schwab, but even, mentioning the fact that, the Empress knew of their relationship again, just you've built up more of the character of Franz Josef already than you have in any of the previous episodes, which is rather remarkable. And again, you focus on his hatred of the fact that Sophie Chotek married Franz Ferdinand and has impugned the dignity of the House of Habsburg. And this is really the first episode which focuses on the prestige of the House of Habsburg. And again, talk about the dying dynasties. There's a wonderful little scene where Count Montenuovo comes in and says, can we perhaps ask for a mitigation of the royal protocol regarding the Habsburgs in perambulating carriages? And Franz Josef says, absolutely not, Count. Any such diminution will be seen as an attack on the dynasty. The system will go on unchanged as it always has. So it's a fascinating little character study, and it's really the only part of Austria, despite it being a very slow, and of course Indian Summer of an Emperor, the calm before the storm, it's the only sort of part of the reflection of Austria that I actually sort of enjoy because of its focus on detail and the focus on royal protocol and the statement of the most highest and all of these little things, which again, separate writers omitted in previous episodes, little inconsistencies.
It actually fleshes out what is a complicated or not complicated, but a complex nation with its own individual characteristics. And as you have here, like the map, for instance, that highlights what would have been sort of territorial Austria, territorial Hungary, and territorial Croatia, that does it at least some justice to explain these factors, rather than just being, oh, just this Austrian Empire with blessed Franz Josef, and then everything else is just an unelaborated sideshow. It's actually fleshed out to some degree, which Austria certainly deserves it in the context of what these shows and this series is meant to represent.
But also, again, just in a couple of lines, he demonstrates the nationality conflicts, the conflicts between the Poles and the Ruthenians, the conflicts between the Germans and the Czechs, the Italians, the Croatians, the Hungarians, the Romanians. And as a result of this, all the previous talk on Hungary seems completely irrelevant, because it's only part of a broader scheme of nationality conflicts which haven't been addressed at all up until this point.
Exactly, and as you've nicely said, because you've actually grouped them sort of in a correct way, that a lot of these different groups would themselves have competing interests within the Austrian realm themselves. Not just themselves; they are necessarily competing with the crown, or are competing with the sort of hegemonic, as an Austrian empire, obviously with the sort of German sort of cadre of elites, but that the Romanians would have issue with the Hungarians, the Croats and the Italians have composing interests, the Ruthenians and the Poles, like you say, and really you kind of feel like this isn't really given the justice it deserves. Thankfully, this episode touches on it, but it's not nearly threshed out as it could be.
Like I said, it just seems that the previous episodes wasted time to present small aspects of history as segmented within a broader anthology, as opposed to contributing to the overall scheme of the series, which this episode actually does. But unfortunately, this episode comes at the expense of a full elaboration of the July crisis. Rather, we have the prelude to the July crisis rather than the examination of it. And again, I have to admonish the 37 Days documentary for its completely simplistic and I would say almost chauvinistic portrayal of Austria-Hungary. And I really do mean that sincerely. And the fact that we portray Franz Josef as just an old senile man surrounded by
duddery old man.
Duddery old man surrounded by these foppish Hungarian aristocrats who have no idea what they're doing, who are just taking orders from Berlin. It really does.
Can I use a phraseology I read in a YouTube comment? Someone said something along the lines of like an earlier the Austrian minister in that show, or the foreign minister, sort of portrayed as like an early 20th century sort of aristocratic metrosexual, which I thought was hilarious, but it's actually not far from the truth.
You mean the ambassador to Britain?
Yeah, the
in
ambassador
Death
to Britain.
Days?
He there's definitely like an effete sort of, but pompish kind of
Everything
notion to
about
him.
it
It's
is
just so odd.
offensive, down to the fact
Yeah.
that Earl Grey shows him no respect. The character is shown to have, limited intelligence,
He
and the
literally
fact,
treats him like a child.
yes, just shuts him down like a child, as if Austria was an irrelevant state,
Mm.
even more irrelevant than Serbia. But coming back to Serbia, later in that show, it's basically presented that the entire ultimatum was accepted by the Serbs, which is not true. So again, it's
Yeah.
to portray Austria in an incredibly negative light and really pandering to
Mm.
this really sort of ancient notion that Austria was just a dying power that had to disintegrate. There was no other path forward.
Mm.
Which what I like about this
a
episode,
rotting
again,
husk is how
yes, a rotting
Austria is
husk.
demonstrated in the show.
And in this episode, again, there is a emperor who is very much cognizant of his role, who is averse to any radical reforms and changes, who is desperate in his mission to uphold the integrity and the splendor of the House of Habsburg. It's very, very well done, very quietly done. There's no sort of grand ceremony about it, and enough is mentioned in this episode to get that fundamental point across, which brings us to the main event, which is Willie and Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand talks about, going on and actually allowing Sophie Chotek to join him in Sarajevo during the Serb national holiday on the 28th of June. He goes there, and this is where all my sort of praise for the episode begins to sour considerably. The way we learn about the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, which is tragic in the sense that we brought up this dichotomy, this antagonism between Franz Ferdinand and Franz Josef over the marriage to Sophie Chotek. He's allowed, because it's not an official state function, to present himself with his wife in Sarajevo, and it is here where they are both assassinated. It is relayed to the emperor, who really doesn't care. He's more interested in getting his preferred successor, Charles, or, the Archduke Karl, as he's presented in the show. And the Archduke Karl is given about 2 lines. One, I think, referring to the domestic situation, and one where he's completely sort of obliviously reading out the telegram, referring to the assassination. And Zita is just there saying, "Yes, oh dear, what shot? What is he? How?" And then Karl just says, "What?" And that's it. That's the entire sort of summation of the final emperor of Austria and King of Hungary. That's it.
Which is sad, because it deserved so much more.
We get no introduction, other than, again, just, you can say, a vacant young man with his wife and his newly born child, who is the Crown Prince Otto. And yes, actually, you forgot about the lunch always being late. John, not real name, is saying yes. That's you can say, going from the sympathetic, and I would say, you can say well-balanced portrayal of Franz Josef, to come to this, it just seems pointless, and again, it sort of counteracts the nuance with which the episode has been able to portray the Habsburgs thus far. It ends off with, again, Franz Josef becoming less sympathetic, where he's talking about maybe it was for the best, basically indicating that he's believes it's a positive development that Franz Ferdinand has been assassinated. And again, that's taking liberties in terms of the extent of his antipathy. And he's again more focused on dialing down the state funeral and wanting to give Sophie Chotek the honors according to a lady in waiting, etc., etc. So you could say that sympathetic betrayal we built up of the Franz Josef is pulled under our rugs towards the end, when we introduce the Archduke Karl as the heir of Austria. And then the episode ends having barely talked about any of the ramifications, other than Conrad von Herzendorf coming in and say, "The people demand, preemptive action against the Serbs." And, Franz Josef, again, seems to be pulled along by the implications of the ministers. No indication as to what Franz Ferdinand represented as part of the Belvedere Circle and the Peace Party. The Hungarians, despite being heavily referenced in before, are not referenced at all as part of the Peace Party under Minister President Tisza, again, which I find the previous installments to be all the more baffling as a result of this. And instead of ending on a summary of the July crisis, we come to Nicholson, who is the Undersecretary of the foreign ministry under Earl Grey. And he basically reads out a statement saying, we believe that the event and he actually reads over and says, Bosnia and Herzegovina, as if it's so obscure and irrelevant that it's not going to have broader implications. And that's what he effectively says. And that's where the episode ends. And that's it for the courses of World War One. So we have an episode that starts off very well, and then I think fails catastrophically in the last 10 minutes. And that is it in terms of the prelude to World War One.
And yes, as we've previously alluded to, it definitely feels incomplete and quite disjointed. Again, the causes for World War One, are there's a multitude of them, and each one is sort of complex in varying degrees, but complex nonetheless. And there's a lot of competing interests and events on all sides or most sides that bring about World War One as we understand it. And you kind of feel that they barely touch on one or two of them almost in a peripheral way, and how the previous line from the previous episode about, the lines are drawn and this is the way it is, as if it's sort of meant to be this kind of historical inevitability. I kind of feel you're quite right to say that it feels, unsatisfactory as an ending to that episode.
What are your thoughts, Charlemagne?
Well, I have yet to rewatch this episode. I will in a few hours, so I only vaguely remember the entrance into World War One. But I do remember just being very unsatisfied by the way the show portrays the path into the war. It almost seems like the writers were afraid to even really get into it. Maybe they felt like it would have simply taken too much time to adequately explain, and didn't want to make a purely historical documentary, and wanted to keep focused on the character drama.
However, though, Charlemagne, I mean, I think it suffers as a result of this. I mean,
Definitely.
the first, I mean, just the character drama alone, let alone the history. The character drama between Franz Ferdinand here and Wilhelm is sufficient to partly explain why Wilhelm talks to the Austrian, the very sort of passive Austrian ambassador, and says to him, the Serbs need to be eliminated at once, and that is essentially how Wilhelm did genuinely react to this, presenting the blank check. And we go from that to, for some reason, Nicholas actually being presented with his family for the first time at the next episode in Levadia, where he's receiving news of the German declaration of war, which gives every possible sort of inkling for the Germans to be the ones responsible for World War One, and the Russians as nothing more than passive receivers of the information, which is absurd, completely absurd, given the fact that Nicholas was not in Levadia at the time. He was in St. Petersburg, monitoring events, responsible for the mobilization, corresponding with Willie Nicky. And this is why, a July Crisis episode was essential in terms of the tragic end of the Dearest Nicky correspondence, which lasted all the way up until the German declaration of war on the 1st of August 1914. Instead, you omit all of that, and you start one of the dullest episodes, which should be one of the most exciting episodes, given the fact that we are talking about Russia's participation in the First World War. And tell the King of the Sky is Falling, when I sort of reflected back on what this episode really represents, it really is just, you can say, the dichotomy between an increasingly unhinged Alexandra and, you can say, Rasputin, who again is, despite his sort of overall presence, he actually has rather brief scenes in this, and the ministerial sort of appointments regarding Russia in this time. At first, we talk about Alexeyev as chief of staff. We talk about Nikolasha, and again, bringing back the Rajkovsky episode, the appointment, and he wants to be Tsar. And later on, we talk about ridiculous figures like Protopopov. And for some reason, the series places an unusual emphasis on Protopopov and his relation with Rasputin. Protopopov wanting, I have the confidence of the highest people, I'm going to bring many new arrangements, etc., 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 and not really going anywhere. There's a lot of talk in this episode, but nothing is really achieved. And it doesn't, I don't think, even sufficiently set up the next episode on the Secret War. And as a result of it, I do really feel that in many ways there is a waste of time. For example, a main figure throughout this is Rodzianko. You bring up Rodzianko if you really want to lean on the idea of what's going to happen after the revolution, where Rodzianko is briefly in control of the provisional government before Kerensky gets in. Instead, Rodzianko is basically omitted from the next episode. Then you have a scene between Rodzianko and the Grand Duchess, Anna Pavlovna, and she talks about annihilating the Empress and her influence. But again, despite the severity of that pronouncement, this doesn't go anywhere. No action is taken against the emperor, against Alexandra, despite sending her sister over to speak some sense into her, and she is immediately sort of admonished and banished from her sight. So again, this is a very unsympathetic portrayal of Alexandra. I would say a less interesting portrayal of Rasputin compared to that of Nicholas and Alexandra, where we do actually see his assassination. We don't see his assassination here, which again, I believe is a missed opportunity. And again, we just talk about his relationship with non-entities such as Minister Trepov, etc., and Protopopov. And it's not. I just think there's a lack of overall focus in terms of what this episode was trying to achieve, especially given how much Ken Hughes tries to get across in The Secret War. And it's interesting because this is actually an episode written by John Eliot again. So this is the last episode we have from John Eliot, who was responsible for The Last Tsar, The English Princess and The Honest Broker. But here it just seems like a very myopic focus on Russia and the relationship between the court and Stavka. And I wonder ultimately what was the overall purpose of this episode, given that we end it with Rodzianko talking to Nicholas II and Nicholas II lamenting, for 22 years it all seems like it's been a mistake, and Rodzianko basically proclaiming, yes, Your Majesty, you've been wrong. But nevertheless, there aren't any consequences actually represented in that episode to justify that sort of severe pronouncement. We don't see any of the battles. We are told again by Michael Horden at the beginning that the Russians retreated to a line which held, but we're not told about the sort of severity of the casualties. You know, Nikolasha talks about, you know, the lack of boots rather offhandedly. So again, one wonders what was the point of this episode when so much more could have been done.
Yes, one at the end of the series, in which it's been building up to the drama of World War I the entire time. When we actually get there, it's sort of barely in the background. It's very odd to choose this direction. Maybe it was a budgetary concern. I'm not really sure.
Also, let's take into account as well, because obviously we've spoken about this on the the historical parts of this channel, that a number of large events happen, and given that this episode does focus, like you say, extensively on Germany and Russia,
this episode just focuses on Russia.
Oh well,
Germany's not referenced at all. This is why again I find the episode is insufficient, because it's not just
doesn't. But this is hang on, we're talking about the Secret War, the second last episode, right?
No, Tell the King the Sky is Falling.
Oh, sorry. Okay, we're still on we're still on the episode 11. Okay, sorry. No, I was thinking that we'd moved on to Secret War because I thought you mentioned it. But yes, I'll hold that point then. Well, what I was going to say is that there is by this myopic focus on Russia, I agree there are other instances in other places where they're ignoring some of the key aspects that lead up to the war. I mean, we have touched on it previously, but I mean, Tell the King the Sky is Falling is exactly the episode whereby you look at the events that were shown in 37 days. You could have shoehorned a part of that into that episode and it would have fit perfectly, because you would have had
the first 20 minutes could have been just devoted to Willie and Nikki back and forth over the ultimate declaration of war, and then just from the 24th of July up until the 1st of August. That would have been, and instead, what do we get out of it? I mean, the one sort of interesting thing historically that comes out of that is Rasputin trying to present himself as anything other than a German spy, as John, not real name, is indicating. The fact that he believes that he was acting the purest interests of God, the fact that he was advocating a pro-peace policy, the fact that he was ordering grain carriages around, and just little things that we focus on the episode, like the daily corruption, like, you know, having to bribe the train, you know, the train conductor with vodka in order for him to do anything. There are tiny little moments where historically it's interesting, but as a drama it fails because there isn't a central impetus towards this. And what you need to culminate with, this is going to be something I'm going to be criticizing later, is the assassination of Rasputin. You need to end it with the assassination of Rasputin. You need to bring in the aristocratic plot of the Romanovs and let them assassinate Rasputin, because you bring in the Romanov plot, you bring in Rasputin, and you don't have the payoff. It's like Sisi again with the lack of the coronation. You need that payoff to make that episode satisfying from the point of view of a contained drama or even a story, and it fails to do that. And instead we have the relationship between the Duma, which is bungled effectively. The Tsar starts the Duma, he dissolves the Duma, etc., etc. And as a result, we are left with the secret war, which is interesting but has severe problems, as Charlemagne has already actually alluded to based on the previous episode, Absolute Beginners, because this is where we return to Lenin after a very long hiatus. Now, Ken Hughes is interesting because I'm wondering why on earth has he written this? Because Ken Hughes was very famous in the late 60s because in 1968 he wrote Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. He also wrote the historical film Cromwell with Alec Guinness playing Charles in 1970, and that was supposed to be his sort of great, you know, leap into historical, you know, films and TV series based on his own funding. And what he really wanted to, and this actually very much informs what he wanted to do with this episode, which is why I believe it fails in the grand scheme, is that he was interested in telling the story of John Reed's The 10 Days That Shook the World, which is an account of the October Revolution, which was later in 1928 turned into a Sergei Eisenstein film about the glorious, you know, beginning of, you know, the foundations of the Soviet Union. And this episode made a lot more sense when I understood that Ken Hughes wanted to make that film and never got the funding to conceive of it. Instead, we have this, because the beginning of the episode is interesting. We talk about, we look into the false portrayal, the propagandistic portrayal of Kaiser Wilhelm as the, you know, the evil warlord, effectively. And instead he starts off by saying, "I did not want this war." Again, they're very familiar with their history, which is why I give this series so much credence. We talk about the unrestricted submarine warfare. We talk about American entry into the war. We talk about using the Bolsheviks as a ploy against Tsarist Russia. We even talk about some of the peace proposals coming from the Central Powers. The Kaiser says, "I guaranteed that every single German soldier will leave and Russian territory will be preserved as is," which the Tsar rebuffed and would not negotiate. So we see the aftermath of the complete collapse of that relationship, and the Kaiser lamenting that relationship. And we can see the beginning of the ultimate tragedy between the Kaiser and Nicholas II, and he by proxy being responsible for Nicholas II's death. Yet at the same time, you needed to see the dramatic end of that relationship with the beginning of the causes of World War I in order to give this payoff. But nevertheless, forgiving the series briefly for that, this is good. This is setting up something very interesting. And then the episode, about halfway through, after we introduce the German general staff, we introduce Hindenburg, we introduce Bettmann-Hollweg, we introduce Ludendorff. Then all of a sudden, around halfway through, we actually come to the revolution. Alexandra and Nicholas again defiant to the last. Even Protopopov looks sane in comparison to Alexandra, which is the impression very much that the writers are trying to give across. And up to the end again, Nicholas is very much under the control of Alexandra, who heads off to Stavka, whilst Kerensky effectively pronounces the end of the Tsarist regime. We don't actually see the real causes of the original February Revolution or the March Revolution, depending on the thing going on. But then it cuts away to Lenin in Switzerland. And
who's rowing a boat on a lake.
Yes, he's
Very
rowing
idyllically.
he's rowing a boat a boat on the lake, and his for some reason Lenin, her first name is escaping me at the moment, but she is reading a newspaper talking about Kerensky's justification for staying in World War One, and he's calling Kerensky a lunatic. Has he not read any books, etc.? And she responds, you know, he's a lawyer, etc. But anyway, from now on, we go away from what's actually happening in terms of Tsarist politics, because Alexeyev has basically told the Tsar, you will abdicate. And this is actually Charles Cray's last ever line. He says, you know, I have sworn to uphold this power as a gift bestowed on me by God, or again, words similar to that effect. And he says, I cannot relinquish that power or that responsibility, even should I wish it. And then Alexeyev says, then I do not ask of your abdication, but demand. And this, from this point of view, point on, the episode completely shifts in its focus. And I believe, as a result of it, completely sort of collapses, because now we focus on the sealed train plot, which is the plan of a Danish financier coupled with the German government to get the Bolsheviks out of Switzerland and into Russian territory through Germany.
And can I say that this scene is actually one of the best in this entire series? I think the way this is portrayed is actually magnificent from a film narrative standpoint.
Well, Charles Cray delivers it perfectly, but it can't be his last scene in terms of the thematic arc of the overall series, because from this point on, this is my hypothesis. Again, there isn't enough extant literature on this to justify this, but this is why I believe, you know, Ken Hughes was interested in doing this episode. He couldn't tell his original story, which was the 10 Days That Shook the World. So he wanted to tell the prequel, maybe to the Sergei Eisenstein film, which ends in Lenin's heroic entrance into Petrograd, St. Petersburg, in 1917. Because from this point on, we're following low-level Bolsheviks and socialists to lead to the sealed train, which passes into German territory. And we come to the ahistorical finale, where Lenin is welcomed into St. Petersburg as a savior, as opposed to the crowd actually being hastily assembled on the sort of demands of operatives on the ground. And again, even ending with a freeze frame of Patrick Stewart as Lenin, and showing the dates as if, and again, this is hagiography in terms of the representation of Lenin, and
the thronging crowds and the cheers, and
the ending was bizarre. I mean, it just it's comical after the weight of the events that are depicted in the episode. It just ends on a freeze frame of Patrick Stewart as Lenin in a very celebratory manner.
And this is where I believe the show ultimately fails in terms of its overall execution, because from a dramatic point of view as a soap opera, you have set up already what the aim of this episode is, which is to show the dramatic conclusion of the relationship between Wilhelm and Nicholas. However, you've only portrayed it to that extent. You need to go further. What you need to do, as was portrayed in the film Nicholas and Alexandra, is show the ultimate culmination of that, which is Lenin being responsible for the murder of the Romanov family in the House of Special Purpose in Ekaterinburg. Instead, you focus on Lenin's arrival and ultimately implied seizure of power, and nothing regarding the horrible events that lead up to that. And instead, you briefly have Michael Hordern refer to it as part of the documentary lecture at the beginning as an afterthought. And again, just to focus on this, they do the same with Franz Josef as well. Charles has no further scenes, Blessed Karl has no further scenes, and Franz Josef is basically sort of explained away as, you know, the emperor's death in 1916, which marked the end of an epoch. What does this mean dramatically? How are you going to conclude this character? You just have the events described in a flat documentary fashion after the fact, and they do this with Nicholas, and I find this astounding, and I do believe as a result of this it fails dramatically. You have that one scene at the beginning of the last episode, Endgame, where the Empress and the Kaiser lament their deaths, but no recognition of responsibility or anything regarding the SEAL train. So I do believe that you had to end this episode, The Secret War, at the death of the Tsar. You start off with the Kaiser and the SEAL train, you end with the death of the Tsar. And because you decided to tell a completely different story, because of the political and sort of creative desires of Ken Hughes, the whole series has failed as a result of that. And I find that really rather remarkable, and a failure from John Elliott as the showrunner.
It's just another example of the lack of continuity from start to finish, that is evident in the series. As nice as this series is, and for all its good points, yes, we raise out at the start, and we can say it here that it's just another example of a lack of continuity and a lack of consistent narrative from point A to point Z. But it is what it is. Sorry, go Charlie.
It seems like some writers didn't want to be constrained by having to tell this typical historical narratives. We see this with the failure to conclude the Rasputin arc, and again with the failure to
Sorry, Chuck. Yeah, I heard most of what you said. But no, it is. I do find it's remarkable, and I do feel it is, again, the problem with these various anthologies, the focus on the lack of focus, and this weird hagiography of Lenin intermersed with this tale of the ultimate. I mean, it is remarkable because Lenin is only he's not responsible for the fall of the Tsar. He is responsible for his death.
Mm-hmm.
And that is why you have to bring in Wilhelm and the SEAL train. And that's where I thought when I saw this episode, it was going, because that seemed logical in terms of ending that relationship. But because you don't have that payoff, again, the ending for Russia seems ill-conceived and hollow. And so you only have, because for some reason you've decided not to focus on, this is another time for another episode, actually between Tell the King the Sky is Falling and the Secret War, because it would actually fit perfectly in terms of the anthology structure of this series, which is an entire episode focusing on the Sixtus Affair. For people who don't know, the Sixtus Affair was the last real attempt of Austria-Hungary to detach itself from the German alliance and to basically present a separate peace with the Allies as a fait accompli. And as a result, Blessed Charles was made to make various concessions, such as basically saying that, yes, the Austrians will acknowledge French control over Alsace and Lorraine. All it ultimately did in the end, because Clemenceau decided to leak the overtures made by the Austrians in the Sixtus Affair, was that the Austrian-German alliance was irrevocably strained, and Germany became more of a dominant, basically, controller of Austrian foreign policy from that point on. However, if you're going to actually give the Austro-Hungarian Empire an interesting send-off, that is a very important facet of history to avoid completely, especially as you've given Karl no respect so far. So again, in terms of all that focus and Tell the King the Sky is Falling on Rasputin's relationship with these, ultimately in the grand scheme of history, peripheral ministers, and then you completely shy away from Austria's entire war, it does seem rather remarkable to me.
Yeah, and I do want to double down on reprimanding the show here on this episode. Nicholas II is probably as much screen time or more screen time than anyone else in the show. In a large part, the series is about him, and to simply fade him out of the series, not even in the last episode, but to also end his episode on this weird hagiography about Lenin, as you said, is just totally unacceptable. I mean, the show should have been more focused on the relationship between Wilhelm II and Nicholas II, and the show ultimately fails to be truly stellar because of this bizarre ending to Nicholas's story arc. That it's completely unsatisfying.
The eccentric Tripper is saying in the chat, didn't Austria kind of die with a whimper? No. The fact is, you can tell the end of Austria thematically two ways. The Sixtus Affair is one such way of telling the end of Austria thematically, because it represents essentially the bondage of Austria to Germany, where its fates are entwined. That's one way you can end the Austrian story. The other way you can end the story of the Eagles, of the Habsburg dynasty itself, is the attempt, or you can say start an episode with the collapse of Austria-Hungary, and then you end with Karl and his two attempts to reclaim the throne of Hungary, resulting in his Napoleonic-esque exile to the island of Madeira. You don't do that either. Instead, you end the entire sort of Austrian part of this series by having the Kaiser just deliver rather offhandedly the remark, "Oh, I've heard news that, the Kaiser has, the Emperor of Austria has fled." First of all, he would never say that in that situation, because that would have been information he was privy to 7 days before, but is never mentioned. But I think that's enough in terms of my frustration with the overall presentation of Austria in this series. I think, the Indian Summer of an Emperor was a good start to something that could have been interesting. And like I said, it's infinitely better than the betrayal of the Austrians in the 37 days. I don't think I'm ever going to be happy with any betrayal of Austria, to be quite frank with you. But like I said, if you focus so much attention on Rajkovsky, why not focus on the Sixtus affair? Why not focus on the Eulenburg scandal? Because all of these things are hidden insofar as they're incredibly obscure for English speakers, and therefore all the more interesting because of it. So again, lack of focus. But we come to the end of the series in Endgame. Rather than me just delivering the sort of overall sort of summation of Endgame, Marcus, because it very much is a German episode, would you like to go over Endgame and what you thought about it?
Oh gosh, you've caught me on the hop here, but Endgame, it's. I actually remember more of the end of it than the start, because I just find that these sort of throngings, we are introduced to the Kaiser and his his leading advisors and the German general staff, Ludendorff, Hindenburg, and obviously with I mean, not that he's a part of the general staff, but intercessions with I've just forgotten the minister, the German chancellor.
Well, Bethmann Hollweg is gone at this point.
Yeah,
Instead,
yes. I had Hollweg on my tongue, but of course he is dismissed. I'm trying to think who his successor was.
I mean, I can't remember his name, but the point
Anyway,
is,
yeah.
the episode the episode starts off by basically establishing that the military command is in control of Germany. Ludendorff is effectively running the war, and
Yes.
Hindenburg is the symbolic figurehead, and the Kaiser is
Yes.
a almost peripheral consideration, albeit it's told from his perspective.
Yes.
And the episode focuses
It could be described as a military dictatorship headed by Ludendorff and Hindenburg, essentially.
Yes, in part, in terms of Hindenburg being the head of state and Ludendorff being the director of the war. Yes.
Yes.
In terms
yes.
of that symbolic role of war leader, the Kaiser has basically been replaced by Hindenburg, the victor of Tannenberg.
Yes.
So that is interesting, and Hindenburg plays an interesting role in this episode. You could say a pivotal role, more influential than that of the Kaiser. But nevertheless, the episode focuses on gaining a peace and what means to attain a peace, and the sort of constitutional upheavals that are entailed in terms of essentially presenting a government which is appealing enough to the Americans who have now entered the war, and the appointment of the Kaiser's cousin, Maximilian von Baden, as the chancellor, a liberal chancellor who is willing to work with Ebert, the leader of the Social Democratic Party, and as a result, present Germany not as a Prussian constitutionalist state where you have a Reichstag, but ultimately it is to consult the emperor, not to mandate the emperor. You don't have government by parliament, which is going back to what Bismarck said. It won't be democratic and constitutional. Well, this is the attempt of Wilhelm II to present something to international onlookers, especially Wilson, that Germany is sufficiently, you can say, amenable to Western public opinion, so as not to be presented as, an evil Prussian autocratic militarist regime, which is the caricature that one has in the West. And to some extent is actually true, given the overall sort of control of the military command and the fact that Bethmann Hollweg has been removed. And instead, you have these lesser chancellors who are taking their place. And again, Maximilian von Baden is very much this last-ditch attempt to try and give the German state a air of respectability. Ludendorff,
and if anything, a bargaining chip with the would-be winners, essentially.
Yes, and Ludendorff narrates this episode. Ludendorff basically explains the military situation as of now. He talks about the failure of the spring offensive, the Ludendorff offensive, and he goes on about August the 4th as, a black day in the history of the German army. The consistent idea is that the German army is no longer a effective fighting machine. We're talking about mass mutinies in the army, and the overall sort of, situation of morale in the on the German side collapsing. You also have a lot of sort of smaller dramas. So you have the Emperor's relationship with the Empress, which is the first time it's ever elucidated, apart from, like I mentioned, those comical scenes you had in episode 3 where she doesn't say a thing. You actually have a relationship here between Willie and Donna in this moment. And you also have a relationship between Willie and the Crown Prince at the same time. The Crown Prince, who coincidentally is having an affair with a French widow, which is also a smaller sort of point. So there are all these little character studies and dramas revolving around Wilhelm. And, you know, his own sort of grasp of the situation and reality as things are fading. So as the situation is increasingly dire, as you know, the Bulgarian army is collapsing, and he talks about this as we enter the November days. He increased. Ludendorff has his mental collapse. This is all portrayed, rather realistically. And the Kaiser decides, I'm going to set up my military headquarters in the style of Frederick the Great. And at the same time, he's talking, well, if I must abdicate, then I'll keep my throne as King of Prussia, and I'll give, my son the title of Emperor of Germany, and again, the Crown Prince is basically portrayed as not only, unfaithful, he's also portrayed as cowardly, because he's saying, no, I don't want to be emperor.
And a bit vainglorious as well. You can sort of see he's got like this sort of superficial pomposity, but then he's not actually in any way considerate, he's not cognizant of his actual duties as Crown Prince.
No, he doesn't seem to care. He doesn't seem to have any sort of notion of the gravity of events, which is quite interesting given his political role we later see in the 1930s. But that, of course, is irrelevant to the proceedings of this channel. But anyway, I mean, the biggest sort of character impression we get from him is when he's on the phone to his French mistress, and he's talking about, oh, yes, I love you more than my wife, and when I get back to you, I'm going to smack you on your little bottom. I mean, that's what we get in terms of the establishment of his character. I mean, I wonder why you decide to sort of introduce that sort of family element to the last point. Maybe it's again to demonstrate the futility of the situation of the Hohenzollerns, the fact they have a Kaiser who is already, basically sort of eclipsed in terms of his own local power, which is held by Hindenburg. You have an heir who is completely unworthy and disinterested, leading to a situation where the Kaiser is entertaining these, lofty notions of reform and these constitutional contrivances to stay in power, until effectively his Ludendorff's replacement after his collapse, General Groener, comes to him and bluntly states to him, indicating his complete dissipation of authority, "We'll get a better peace without you, Your Majesty," and no one will stand and support the emperor in this case. I mean, you also see these brilliant, I can only call them sort of Forsterisms in terms of his portrayal of really, where this is also the first time that we see the mention of the Spanish influenza, and he comes in and Maximilian von Baden is coughing and spluttering, and he's like, "Max, do you have the influenza?" I do believe I do. I do believe I have, Your Majesty. "We shouldn't be in the same room with you." Sort of rushes off. So,
I have to say, those dialogues are just something that do make me chuckle. They're so intentionally over the top and play into that sort of Prussian German caricature, but he does them wonderfully as an actor. It's superb.
So it is
as is your impersonation, if I may say so.
All right. Well, I mean, this is a form of acting, I suppose. It is a form of presentation. But no, these little sort of Forsterisms are wonderful to sort of hold as we see the culmination of, again, you can say the central anti-hero or protagonist of the Fall of Eagles series, and what the show has erroneously, from a historical point of view, decided to be the last man standing, when we know from Charles's attempts in Hungary that wasn't actually the case. It's interesting. It's interesting, nevertheless, and we end the series on a rather sort of downbeat note. After Admiral Muller has sort of ignored the emperor and going off as the emperor pontificates on. There's some wonderful schemes mentioned in this episode, like, yes, well, we're in a situation like the Punic War, Rome versus Carthage, an alliance with, was it Britain and Japan, to drive the Americans out of Europe. And everyone just looks at him completely sort of flabbergasted, and the Kaiser's like, "Oh, well, I suppose not.
Oh dear.
It is rather sort of remarkable, the sort of the culmination of all these little sort of aspects of his character. And I mean, I find Wilhelm endlessly sort of fascinating as a historical figure. And I mean, I would sort of recommend that because you, Marcus, and I have done an episode on him, that you try and revisit that portrayal, because he's a very interesting character, regardless of the over dramatized sort of melodramatic iteration of him we're often presented with. But nevertheless, from this point on, he accepts the inevitability of his situation. He goes into exile. The generals having basically said that we must be, the Hindenburg in particular, we must preserve the social order. We can't preserve the emperor, but we can preserve the army. Which wasn't really true in many respects, given the prescriptions of the Treaty of Versailles. Nevertheless, Hindenburg, ironically, does hold on to power in some form in Weimar Germany as president, and the army does act as that, you can say, continuation of the Prussian state all the way up until 1944.
Can I make a clarification on that point, just briefly? The army is obviously, in the form of the Reichswehr, is a diminished institution after the war, and as a result of the stipulation of the Versailles Treaty, that is true. But if you were to take that statement about preserving the army literally, if you consider the fate of the Wehrmacht of 1945, one can say, even though the German army was being pushed back into Germany, it still largely maintained lines in France and Belgium at the end of 1918, and the army was intact. You might say the soldiers survived, which at least in that sense was true.
This is another aspect, you can say, of the episode which I haven't really covered, which is Ludendorff's breakdown. Because Ludendorff, as you mentioned, is the prime director of the German military situation, albeit he's replaced in this episode by Groener. And here he talks about the emperor has been betrayed by civilians. And this, of course, is the episode famously setting up the origins of the stab in the back theory, which Ludendorff, of course, elucidates and goes off and becomes a political player in the 1920s before he's completely eclipsed. But nevertheless, they're setting this up in this episode, that the German army has been, up until this point, an effective machine. And we see elements of it where we see the various revolutionary societies springing up. We don't see, say, for example, the mention of the revolutionary antics in Munich and Bavaria in the whole, but we talk about them in Berlin. And
also the Salia, the naval mutinies in Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, etc.
Do they actually mention the naval mutinies in Kiel?
I seem to remember that they do, because when they said, "Oh, the home front collapsing," and I seem to remember them mentioning the Navy, but I could be wrong. But even if that's not true, for those listening, that was historically a thing which happened. The Navy was actually the first branch of the military that threw it out.
And by extension, that was a direct threat against the emperor's own personal authority. Correct. Because the Navy, more so than the army, had a loyalty particular to Wilhelm II as its effective creator.
Germany, was his baby, very much.
Germany had no effective navy at all until Wilhelm II conceived of it as such. And during his reign, not only did he create a German navy, it was the second largest navy in the world. But nevertheless, the navy was ineffective ultimately in terms of being able to reverse the situation where the British blockade, again mentioned in this episode, had a severe effect on the home economy and ultimately starvation throughout Germany, which precipitated this revolt and the breakdown of. But again, maybe something interesting to note is that we don't really see, other than the moving of troops from east to west, we don't necessarily see the plans in the east for the ruin of the Russian Empire and what Germany intended to create in the east post-Brest-Litovsk. But I can understand, again, compared to all the stuff we talked about in terms of character omissions and things which are historically pertinent, that's one of the lesser things you can sort of quibble about. But nevertheless, it ends on a downbeat note, which I actually like, which is the emperor going into his Dutch exile, and he comments, oh, this is the end of an epoch. And in response to, a very sort of, I can't remember the host of his Dutch exile to begin with, but after sort of, again, being ignored. Again, it's sort of tragic when you look at Wilhelm II and his betrayal in this episode, how he continually makes these grand statements only to just be ignored by everyone around him. And this is no exception. But in the end, he simply ends off the series by saying, wouldn't it be wonderful to have a good cup of English tea? Which another theme going through this episode is the absence of real coffee. And
Yeah,
indeed the previous
shortages,
episode.
yeah.
So that's the ending of Fall of Eagles. And as I've
Mhm.
already noted that if you begin the series with Hungary, you could end the series with Hungary with the return of Charles. But given the actual sort of dues this show has given Charles, which is none, it's not surprising that he just gets waved away and Austria's fate is sealed in a throwaway line,
Yeah.
in the same way that the fate of Nicholas II and his family is basically mentioned offhandedly by Michael Horden at the beginning. I mean, it's not
Yes.
even actually explicitly mentioned what happened to them. I believe the exact quotation is, the Kaiser didn't want to end up like Nikki and Alexandra, as if, again,
Yes.
assuming that the event is so well ingrained in popular culture that the audience just knows what happens.
But then again, I did reference this earlier in the stream, whereby if you think that this was made in the mid-70s, I would say that the knowledge of the fate of the Tsars was it might not have been tremendously commonplace, but much more so in the public consciousness than what it would certainly be today. I would stand by that statement. I could be wrong, but I would believe that to be true. And the second thing is, I do agree with you that it's a pity that the Karl Austria thing is omitted. But that being said, I do love that scene where Barry Foster playing the Kaiser is on that set, which sort of represents, I suppose, his command post in the West, and the train's loaded and they're about to embark to the Netherlands where they go into exile, which is obviously what historically happened to the Hohenzollerns. And he just sort of looks around and he, ponders what might have been, and there's just an empty table where, once upon a time, the entirety of the general staff in Hindenburg and Ludendorff and von Bülow and all these, von Mackensen, all these characters. Well, actually, you've got them here on this photo. Moltke, the younger, etc. And then there's nobody. There's no chairs. There's no personnel. No general staff. No, even all like the artworks taken down, all the artifacts, etc., which were the belongings of the Kaiser. And there's just empty room, and he kind of just looks, and then he sort of walks off into retirement, and then there's just like this empty set. I don't know, like just from a filmography standpoint, I find that a poignant way to have ended the show. I do agree with you that touching on Karl and Austria would have been better from a historical standpoint, but from a cinematography.
Oh no, I agree with
I
you,
think,
but I feel that this treatment was owed to every member of the final surviving member of the house, and it's only given to the Kaiser.
I don't disagree with you at all. I think that's very true.
Like I said, I felt that Nicholas II deserved such a treatment in the previous episode. The Kaiser, he gets half a treatment, but not a full treatment. The Kaiser deserved a treatment in this episode, and perhaps Karl deserved a final send-off with his Hungarian tragedy in the last episode to end on what you established at the beginning of this series, which was Hungary.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the ending is, I very much like the melancholy of the ending. You're right, if the other monarchs should have been treated the same way, at least in the final episode, we do get an appropriate ending for at least one of them. And it's not like the ending of Nicholas's arc.
Absolutely, and I just want to emphasize again, Marcus, there are little moments. I mean, I already hinted at this right at the beginning with the betrayal of, Verdi at the opera at the beginning. There are little hints where the actual sort of set piece material and the imagery and the show not tell angle is conveyed brilliantly, despite the film, the series is, hilariously low budget. And that is all, again, to the benefit of the series and the director exploiting his limited resources and using them effectively. But I mean, regarding my overall sort of, ways to improve the series, I mean, like I said, in isolation, many of the episodes are excellent. They're well written. They're well sourced. The acting, in many cases, is superlative. And where my criticism comes in is over a lack of overall focus, a lack of consistency, and a lack of the ability to portray an overall development of these characters and to give them satisfying endings. Again, such criticism would be pertinent if one were to ever remake this series, but I have no faith that such a series will ever be remade, unfortunately, as much as I would like it to be.
That being said, given the way things are presently, I would hope that they don't. I would like for the paradigm to be different before this is dug up and remade. In the instance that it is, God willing.
Well, the only time where there would have actually been any sort of upswell from the BBC would have been back in 2018 to commemorate the centenary of the armistice, maybe.
Mm.
But like I said,
Or potentially like 2014 to coincide with the beginning of the war, sort
well,
of thing. But
that's where we have
yeah,
37 days with the July
well,
crisis,
true.
which I
Yes,
think,
yes, of
which
course, yes.
so like a series like this, I think could have saved to 2018, but like I said, it
Mm,
wouldn't happen. But anyway,
mm,
those are my criticisms, those are my praises, and of course, remember,
mm.
my suggestion of a Eulenberg episode and a Sixtus Affair episode. But apart
Mm.
from that,
I actually agree with you too. I think the Eulenberg thing and events pertaining to Germany, say like the Agadir Tangier crisis, whatever. I think there would have been some wriggle room there for a very intriguing episode that was sadly forgone. I completely agree with you there.
so Charlemagne, do you have any overall sort of concluding thoughts on the series?
Well, above all, it's an excellent series that's certainly above and beyond anything that could be possibly produced today. It is greatly flawed, but it's not like there's any possibility of any of these flaws being repaired in a sort of remake, as you just alluded to, as we're just utterly incapable of respecting the history of this era at all. I think it does, for all its faults and sometimes schizophrenia and how it portrays certain characters. I think it overall comes out as a rather fair portrayal of the last monarchs of each of these families, and it's certainly chock full of historicity, even if it leaves out some rather important instances that should be gone over. So I definitely recommend the show. I'm going to finish rewatching it this weekend, and I've certainly enjoyed the rewatch. So it's both entertaining. It is a pure drama, so you do really have to be into drama, pure drama series in order to really appreciate it. But I think anyone in our sphere ought to watch it.
Yes, I concur absolutely with those statements.
Hmm.
It is Shakespearean. I mean, you can view it essentially as 14 one-act plays next to one another.
It's
In
actually
that
very
shape.
nicely put. I agree.
And regarding, the individual performances, Lawrence Naismith as Franz Josef, Charles Kay as Nicholas II, and of course Barry Foster as Wilhelm II are all superb, brilliantly cast. My only sort of lament in that case would be that Naismith were given more screen time, and you can do away with the entirety of episode 1 and Mars Anderson's portrayal of the young emperor. It sort of irks me on a little petty note that he doesn't actually look anything like Franz Josef. Weirdly enough, actually, Franz Josef actually looks quite close to me in terms of the overall appearance, hinting at that if anyone's going to spot me in real life. But moving on, the only historical portrayal of a major character, which I'm really unhappy with, as I mentioned, was the portrayal of Empress Alexandra. I'm not sure what exactly was going on there. I'm not sure whether it was the writing or whether it was. I'm trying to find the actress now. For some reason on the list, it's rather difficult to actually find her. Maybe it's an episode. But anyway, if someone can find a name of the actress who played Alexandra, I'm not exactly sure what to attribute it to, but it seems almost comically insane in parts. There are some moments where she's able to sort of convincingly sort of portray, emotion rather effectively, especially regarding the fate of the Tsarevich Alexis. But I found that the portrayal of Alexandra in the film in which this was partly inspired by, Nicholas and Alexandra, was much better and far more relatable as a human being, rather than the Alexandra in this, who is, I think, thoroughly unrelatable and comes off as rather unlikable. And if nothing else, it's understandable as to why she was so unpopular, if this is in any way a true portrayal of her. So yeah, I'll move on to the super chat.
Just very briefly, I just want to mention too is some of the other people that were cast, I think, suit their roles perfectly. Even though he didn't have a particularly large role, I think again, I suppose because of the association we have with his character in Star Wars, but I thought Kenneth Colley was really good as Father Gapon, as small as that role was. Just seeing him like with this massive sort of Orthodox beard and dressed in garb is hilarious. But from like a standpoint of actual acting quality, despite the fact he's only in one episode, I think Michael Bryant, I think it was, played Rajkovsky extremely well. I think getting that sort of sheer cunningness across is something he conveyed extremely well. I think the actors who
I find it rather interesting that, like I said, in the film in which this was partly inspired by, he plays Lenin.
correct.
So it's interesting that he plays the adversary in this film.
Yeah, the opposite, exactly right. And speaking of Lenin, I think Patrick Stewart was phenomenal as Lenin. I actually don't think that they could have got a better person. I just think the way he encapsulates even Lenin's mannerisms is absolutely flawless. Ironically, too, I think the guy that plays Bronstein or Trotsky fits that perfectly. The person who plays Martov, I think, plays Martov perfectly. And I can't remember the name of the character in like the old like Oksana Russian, the fat like the grandmother woman in that sort of early leadership of the Soviets. I can't remember her name, like the one who really hates Lenin. I can't think of the character's name, but like she plays that role really, really well. I just think there's such an attention to detail with casting that so many of these people play their roles well. The guy who plays Holstein, I think, plays Holstein very well, for instance. I think the casting of this show has actually is for the most part excellent.
Yes, the historical character is Sasulich, and she is played by Mary Wimbush.
Thank you. Yes, I just couldn't think of the name. Yeah, so yeah, I like the way she just like encapsulates this sort of like simple but blunt Russian who just has this instinct to dislike Lenin because he's like a scummy creature. I think she just conveys it perfectly.
I mean, even like smaller roles like Lynn Farley as Krupskaya, the wife of Lenin, I enjoyed. But yes, I mean, Patrick Stewart does sort of, again, you can almost say as part of the subtle aspect of hagiography of Lenin, Patrick Stewart does lend to Lenin a gravitas and an aristocratic air, which wasn't apparent if you actually met Lenin in real life, interestingly enough, almost transcending him as a character. The actress who played Alexandra was Gail Hunnicutt, as someone was mentioning in the chat, an American actress.
Yes.
I'm going to have to, well, probably not, I don't have the time, but watch her in other things in order to make a conclusion about her acting skills.
And just very briefly too, just like some other note words. I mean, I've mentioned Kurt Jürgens before because I love him, but he was excellent in Bismarck. He's probably one of the best actors in this entire series. The man who played Holstein was an actor by the name of Frederick Jaeger, who was like British German, sort of worked in both seeing, you know, both the German and English film industries. And Tony Jay, who played Alexander III, I thought was exceptional. And of course, you mentioned the man who played Nicholas II. He was also excellent. Like, there's just so many people who play these roles, you know, so well. I mean, we could list more and more off, but for the sake of time, I'll leave it there. But there's just a number of characters that are extremely well cast.
On that note, Pellinor Whitestrake for £4.50, thank you very much. Bismarck does a fine impression of Kurt Jürgens. A wonderful show. So absolutely, Pellinor Whitestrake, and that's very pertinent. Yes, he gets across his imposing character and the insane bouts between melodrama, weeping, and the physical presence of him, the ferocity and the brilliance of him all come across in that performance.
And also when in like his intimate discussions, you know, when he's talking with say he's having a conversation with Moltke, you know, in episode 2, you know, discussing sort of elements about, you know, well, how we unify Germany and how we blah blah. You know, he does convey like this softness. And
do you know what I find actually on that note? One of my favorite scenes with him is when we have we have the boy iteration of Wilhelm II.
Yes, at the table.
Yes, Wilhelm II, and the later Wilhelm II, who is only like a teenager at this point, is asking Bismarck, who's just been made a count by his grandfather, how would you create war with France? And he very frankly just talks about, we'll make your cousin Prince Leopold heir to the Spanish throne. The Spanish will be happy to have Hohenzollern, but the French will object. When they refuse to accept his candidacy, we will attack. But that's a secret. Again, it's just these world-changing plans, which of
Mm.
course was essentially the explanation that the show gives for the casus belli against France, and it's portrayed as a sympathetic moment of character building between
Mm.
Bismarck and the young Wilhelm II, which is a brilliant
Mm.
sort of introduction to that character relationship, which is built
Mm.
on when we have another scene in the future episode where he talks about, Wilhelm II is talking about, I want to make Germany a world power. There's so
Well,
many situations to create. And then we have that
Mm.
incredibly famous quote from Bismarck, which is, a politician can never create anything. He can only stop and listen to the footsteps of God sounding through events and then wrestle at the helm of his garment. So
yes,
just
that's
in
right.
terms of, I mean, here there are little moments where every little character moment actually advances not only the plot, not only the
Mm.
relationship, but also the history. And in that
Mm.
sense, this is where this is all written by John Eliot. This is where
Mm.
the series really shines and shows a true brilliance, which I don't think will come across in any sort of modern
Yeah,
docudrama that can
absolutely.
compete. However, it's just unfortunate that there are so many errors which
Mm.
bring this down at the same time. But that particular moment, just to
Correct.
emphasize, is where Fall of
Mm.
Eagles really begins.
Oh, truly. And just to finish my point on Kurt Jürgens specifically, like he does transition from these sort of soft, intimate moments, of just low key, almost casual, but still eloquent and erudite conversation in dialogue with these other characters. Whether it's young Willie or the elder Wilhelm II, or with Moltke, and then he sort of like bursts into these fits of like rage or bravado and these other emotions. Kurt Jürgens really does an exceptional job of this range that he's able to portray as Bismarck. And for those who actually are interested in cinematography and films and this sort of stuff, Kurt Jürgens, for instance, in The Longest Day plays General Blumentritt, which is a far drier character than say Bismarck, but he's the way he acts in that is absolutely wonderful. And even though he has a very small number of lines in the movie Battle of Britain, he plays essentially the German foreign minister in that, and he only has, I think, maybe 3 or 4 lines in the entire movie, but just his delivery in both English and in German is exceptional, and it's a wonder they actually got Jürgens for this, because I think having an actual German with a command of English was the right thing to do, and his performance in Fall of Eagles is magnificent. So
I think on that,
that's my Kurt Jürgens simping done.
I think on that note, if you're interested in episode 2 in particular, I would actually check out the German film from 1940 just called Bismarck, in which
I'll have to check it out.
Paul Hartman plays Bismarck, because it focuses on the relationship between Bismarck and Napoleon III, which this series doesn't at all. So if you want a gripping portrayal which covers the events only really between 1862 and 1866, so therefore it's much more focused. Yes, it's a film made during Nazi Germany, but nevertheless it's interesting enough to watch because again it's something that's really.
I take it you've seen it then on that.
Yes,
on
of
that
course
note.
I've seen it.
Okay, yes.
But again, it focuses like this does, and I'm sure when this episode was made, because it focuses primarily on the animosity and ultimately the healed relationship between the Crown Prince and Bismarck. Obviously, this series goes the other way with that, but that is sort of the core sort of dramatic element, wrestling control of the king between the Crown Prince and Bismarck. So maybe watch that as well if you're interested in episode 2. And again, maybe if you're going to watch this,
I'll have a look.
maybe if you're going to watch that, start with episode 2. Get through the Queen Victoria and the Princess Victoria stuff. Even though what a very famous actress, Gemma Jones, been in tons of things, she is very good as Vicky.
Actually, yes, I forgot to mention her, but she plays Vicky extremely well.
Absolutely fantastic. So maybe start with that. Maybe omit episode 1, because, like I said, unfortunately, the more you sort of look into it, the more tangential episode 1 does, and all it does, I think, is do a disservice to the series as a whole in turning people off actually pursuing this any further, if they can even get through the first 10 minutes of episode 1, especially with the level of production values, which I understand for other than hardcore history buffs is quite off-putting. John, for $50, that's Very generous of you. Thank you, John. Stumbling upon your channel has truly been a blessing. I very much enjoyed listening to your streams. Thank you for being such an invaluable source of learning. Well, thank you very much. Well, this has been, obviously, I may get quite a few historical details wrong because I'm doing this mainly off memory. Unfortunately, I don't have a book of sort of notes or references to sort of go off apart from my memory of the series, unfortunately. So hopefully the information I've given at least has been somewhat accurate. But thank you, John, regardless. And I'm very grateful for your super chat and your compliments. So thank you very much. And that also goes to Charlemagne, to Marcus, and of course, everyone else, including Columba especially, who has contributed to the channel. So thank you so much. AJSJ for $10. Your work continues to be brilliant. As a regular Discorder, I ask you to look into mods for the Discord. Unsavory people have come around and will get the community scattered to the wind. Yes, well, I actually don't know. Someone is going to have to explain to me how that works, because I do all of the social media stuff and all of the sort of admin stuff on my own. I've only just really got the hang of even doing the comments section properly here. At least I've handled how to create moderators on YouTube. So someone is going to have to tell me how to create moderators, and I'm going to have to find trustworthy people to do that. But yes, I completely agree with you. But even though I do come in every so often and I do check the comment section, and they haven't been too bad so far. So yes, everyone join the Discord, and I'll be adding a lot of knights and deputies and viceroys to administer on behalf of Apostolic Majesty. So do join the Discord.
We'll have to get Lady of Shalott and mount her on her gallant white horse and have her patrol the the Discord with as much fervor and zeal as she does the chat usually.
It's interesting, John, not real name, that you just mentioning in the comments that you dislike episode 1 so much. It's interesting, isn't it, that obviously his moniker is Blessed Charles. It's interesting that the Austrian simps are all saying this. Ignore the Austria episodes. No, it does unfortunately more of a disservice than a benefit to Austria, unfortunately, because like I said, the fundamental problem with that episode, it doesn't set up anything which is brought to a satisfying conclusion. The characters are, all expendable, and it doesn't fundamentally explain what Austria is and why we should care, which is what they do somewhat more effectively with Prussia and Germany, but not to that much satisfaction with Russia, albeit they introduce much more social factors there, which make it more interesting. The eccentric tripper for $5, thank you very much. Damn fine stream as always, AM. Listening to you on any topic is always a delight. I only wish I had more to give, keeping up the incredible work. Well, thank you, the eccentric tripper, and thank you to everyone. It's been for some reason very complimentary, the super chat, so thank you very much. It means so much. Polish ambassador for 10 zloty. So when stream about Polish historical movies, Polish ambassador, you know that I've placed a prescription on anything to do with Poland on this channel. So never, obviously, we will discuss everything. We will discuss, I will do a 4-episode series on the history of Montenegro before I do Polish history.
We'll even touch on the foundation of the modern Papuan state before we do Poland. So
maybe I'll do a history of Andorra, a history of San Marino before we get to the history of Poland,
and a 2-part special on the German then British colony of Cameroon.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because Poland isn't mentioned at all.
Actually, that's an
interesting oversight that I didn't even think about.
It's actually hilarious because it plays such an important role. I mean, if people who don't know the political geography, I actually don't think I have a map, but anyway, I have a map of Austria.
Given like the 3 eagles, right? Represent
the 3 eagles represent 3 corners of Poland.
And they're the ones who ate the Polish state in the
They are the partitioners, yes.
They are the partitioners, exactly right.
Yes, Russia has, Warsaw and Lodz and Lublin and central Poland. Prussia has Poznan and Gdansk, and what was obviously then very German Silesia, but is now Wrocław and what is now a Polish province all the way up into the River Oder. And the Austrians, of course, have the city of Krakow, Lemberg, which is now in Ukraine, but obviously was a major source of contention between the Poles and the Ruthenians. I think that's the only time the Poles are mentioned in
And
that
it's why,
episode.
and it's why Lviv, for instance, has very Viennese architecture, for instance.
Well, yes, I mean the architecture is from that period pre-1914, when
Yeah.
it was in 1915, of course, it was occupied by the Russians. Again, a point which is barely sort of mentioned or brought up. Is the Brusilov offensive actually brought up in my least favorite episode?
Well, I was going to say, when I thought you had moved to episode The Secret War, and you said that no, we're still talking about the Tell the King the Sky's Falling. What I was actually going to mention is you read my mind again. The Brusilov offensive is not a mention. The near collapse of the Austrian front on the Carpathian front is literally a non-factor, when it was one of the sort of decisive reasons why the Germans ended up pivoting eastward in 1916, was to help buttress Austrian efforts in the east. But anyway.
Oh dear. Well, apparently the Fall of Eagles series has as much contempt for Polish history, Polish ambassador, as we do. So we'll continue in that fine tradition. All right. Yes, I know you had an eagle. Everyone had an eagle. Come on. Serbia had an eagle. Byzantium has an eagle. Doesn't Kosovo, Albania has an eagle. I'm trying to think of all the other countries that have an eagle, but my mind is just going. Essentially, any country with any sort of history with, connection with the Byzantine Empire
that descended from Rome,
or claims any sort of. I mean, the Spanish, in some iterations of their thing, also have an eagle. Just so many more.
Even America has an eagle.
Sorry. Even America has the bald eagle, so everyone has an eagle. Eagles for everyone, except Poland. Poland can't have an eagle, even if it does. We'll just ignore the fact that Poland has an eagle.
Oh.
Yeah. But it's interesting, isn't it, that Hungary is given so much inexplicable attention and Poland is not mentioned.
Yeah, there's quite a few things which are interesting that they haven't mentioned. This is probably not a bad way to sort of maybe put a cap on the conversation, is that, you think we've mentioned 37 Days, and that series is probably a good thing to watch maybe after you've watched Fall of Eagles, because it does add a lot of content. As slanted and as one-eyed as 37 Days is, it is a nice, insofar as modern productions are concerned, it is a good one, and I do enjoy watching it. It's great entertainment, and I think it is itself a quality production in its own right. Another show that's worth watching too, if you don't mind subtitles and foreign films, is one called 1864, which is told from the Danish perspective of the Schleswig-Holstein War, where actually Austria and Prussia together fight the Kingdom of Denmark. And this event here, which is in some ways the making of Bismarck more so than the events of 1866 and the Austrian-Prussian War, is the making of Bismarck, and really is the foundation of his career going forward as Chancellor. This conflict is completely overlooked, totally. Much like the partition of Poland is totally ignored, and the what Bismarck calls in the show the upset of 1848 is ignored. There's so many sort of historical factors proximal to this that are sadly overlooked or just dismissed in Falls of Eagle. But if you watch some of these other shows, they plug in quite nicely to Fall of Eagles and sort of add more context and sort of situational, historical relevance to the things that they might have missed in the show. So I definitely recommend 37 Days, which AM and I both mentioned. 1864, which is a Danish show about the Danish, the Schleswig-Holstein War, is also a good thing to watch alongside this. What other shows can we mention plug in nicely to
I just want to say on the Polish note again, to give Polish ambassadors some sort of
a crumb.
Were it not for the Crimean War, and were it not for Prussian posture in 1863 during the Polish-Lithuanian uprising, 1863, Germany could not be unified, and that is again completely omitted. So yes, Polish history, weirdly, the crushing of the Polish revolt was, in my view, responsible for German unification, because Alexander II, again not mentioned, despite the fact he was assassinated. Alexander, is even the train carriage accident mentioned? No, I don't think it is. I think Alexander II's assassination is only mentioned in a flashback. Alexander II had a much better relationship with Germany, built off the the great betrayal during the Crimean War. Anyway, on a note of other eagles, yes, John Not Real Name has mentioned, yes, there is indeed the Eagle of Saladin. And if I remember correctly, the Eagle of Saladin is the emblem of Egypt, the emblem of Iraq, the emblem of Palestine, the emblem of Yemen. So yes, eagles for everyone. Absolutely. Even I'm not sure actually where the origin of the Eagle of Saladin comes from, whether he just took it from the Byzantines or whatever, because it's double-headed originally, I think. So probably most likely just it's kind of like when Semiagog and you and I, Marcus, discussed the origins of the crescent moon and the star being a Corinthian symbol loaned to the Byzantines through the Megarian conquest. Interesting, the idea was transmitted through Byzantium, as all of these ideas are, showing the enduring relevance of Byzantium, including the conception of the double-headed eagle to represent the two Romes, East and West, and the second Rome being, of course, Constantinople. So
Indeed.
Going back to the image at the beginning, all I have to say, all the way down, it all ends with Byzantium. So there you are.
Constantinople is the mother of all double eagles.
Yes, anyway, that's it for this evening. All I would say is, Charlemagne, anything you would like to say before we leave?
I'll get better internet soon by building a big pole. And yeah, it was a pleasure to review the series with you. Maybe we could do some more of these in the future. I have browser tabs open for basically every show you guys mentioned during the discussion, so I'll be looking forward to watching some of those. So thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure to have you on, Charlie. It's just been a shame about the occasional cutouts when you get to the juiciest part of your point you're making. Anyway, Marcus, anything you'd like to say or shill before we get out of here?
Nothing new specifically, but again, thanks. I always love these tangential kind of discussions that we have. We sort of pick certain topics or certain shows or whatever, and we I find they're quite fantastic. And for all of the, shall I say, the difficulties that can sometimes exist, living in the time and the era that we do, these kind of reflections and discussions are in varying degrees enlightening and fun and lighthearted and a little bit autistic in the positive sense of the word. And I think even though that whether it's this show that we're discussing, Fall of Eagles, made in the mid-70s, or whether we're talking about 37 Days, which was made 40 years afterwards, and yes, they're going to have their representations of certain people and certain figures and whatever, but being able to actually enjoy sort of these productions and certain films and whatever, and you accept the frame that they are obviously inevitably going to be produced or filmed in or whatever, they're still worth enjoying. They're still worth consuming. And for those of us with a strong orientation or a strong sort of intellectual bedding in history, that it's rare for us to get these kind of productions, and then where they exist and where they are made, if we can take them for what they are, they can be a source of enjoyment for us. Even if you sort of, oh yes, there's this inconsistency, and that's wrong or this is wrong, and we can nitpick it, which is what we've done tonight. But that there are things still worth appreciating. Like even in the Ashes, there are still things that we should enjoy, and I think shows like this is one such example.
Yeah, I would say I agree with your comments wholeheartedly, though I would sort of take slight umbrage at the idea that nitpicking. I mean, when I conceive of criticism, I am trying to sort of get to the root of the problem and trying to find a solution.
It was a throwaway term, but you know what I mean. Shall I say a thorough critique instead? But that aside, I've thoroughly enjoyed this as I've done all the other episodes. As always, our audience is wonderful. Always a pleasure to work with Charlie. He's one of the best guys in our field. Thank you as always. You're very gracious to have me on the channel as much as you do. And until next time, I guess I'll see everyone later. So yeah, thank you.
Yes, right.
But
I mean, when I am in terms of trying to contextualize my criticism, again, it is constructive criticism. Again, ostensibly for a sequel that will never happen given the current climate, which is unfortunate. But nevertheless, I'm invested enough to criticize an obscure docudrama from the 1970s because it is one of these rare things which I believe has so much potential and just manages to miss the mark, which is unfortunate, which is why I give it the title of A
It
Diamond
is.
in the Rough. It is really worth going out and seeking out and, you know, watching it for, you know, the 12 and a half hours, 14 episode content. Maybe Son's the first one, unless you have, I mean, just watch the CC trilogy. I mean, maybe you can get over the subtitles, but that's far more engaging than watching that first episode, which again is just a homage to that film. So
to my last, sorry, just one last quick point, and I'll make this, I'll end here. But one thing that we should all sort to do, because in the end we don't know what lies ahead, but if there are things that you like, such as Fall of Eagles or whatever, at the very least try and get yourself your own digital copy. And if it is indeed possible, get yourself a physical copy, because, you know, these things are becoming increasingly rare. You know, we're facing times where access to these things becomes difficult, and it will become increasingly difficult. So if you can actually have your own, all the better.
yes, and absolutely, I concur, and that's actually what I've been doing regarding physical content. Getting physical content of things is very important given what's happening. Absolutely agree with you. So just again, just to finish up my point, like I was saying, all of this is meant based on the potentialities and the unique vision of this series, which isn't fully realized. And I do believe analyzing media, documentaries, drama, especially from my historical lens, I'm very much invested in getting the best possible historical content out there, in terms, not just in terms of education, but in terms of dramatic payoffs as well. So this has been as much a dramatic criticism of Fall of Eagles in terms of a lack of satisfying payoff as it has been a historical critique, and not even really a historical critique, but just focusing more on building what the original purpose of this was by emphasizing the drama, allowing for that character transition. If anything, you could say that this had the potential to be a modern equivalent of a late 19th century War and Peace, and just misses the mark, unfortunately. It's fascinating, this series, and I would like to learn more about why it came about, especially how all of these disparate sort of groups of left-wing, you know, screenwriters in the BBC decided to focus in on this particular aspect of history. I've already sort of got my suspicions, but nevertheless, be interesting to learn more about this. Anyway, thank you everyone for listening. Thank you, Marcus and Charlemagne, for being such wonderful guests. Thank you to everyone who sent a super chat. And this channel will probably be back doing more stuff on Friday, where we actually go over one of the characters mentioned in this, Alexander III mainly, and the early reign of Nicholas II, focusing on unshakable autocracy and a character who was omitted from the series, Konstantin Pobedonitsiev, the writer of Reflections of a Russian Statesman. So thank you everyone again, and goodbye.